Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wild and wacky world of anime. This week on the show, it is our season finale, our true season finale for Season 2 of Japanimation Station, Ufotable Moon Works. We have been on a long journey, Jonathan. We've watched through all of the Kata no Kyokai movies. We watched Fate Zero, we watched Unlimited Blade Works, we watched Heaven's Feel, and that was all to bring us to this moment where we are going to discuss the culmination of the Fate franchise, the keystone of anime itself, truly. A show that is actually great and is so much better than it has any right to be. Emiya no Kyo no Gohan, or today's menu for the Emiya Family, the cooking show, slice of life spinoff based on the hit manga, I'll call it. And it is fucking awesome.
It is fucking awesome. But wait, that's not all, Sean. This episode...
There's more!
It's a double header, because in the second half of today's episode, we are also doing a deep dive on, this is not an anime yet, although it will soon be, but the visual novel Witch on the Holy Night, Mahoutsukai no Yoru, which got a remake last year in 2022 on the Nintendo Switch and PS4 and is out in English, the first Type Moon visual novel out in English. And we wound up talking about it through every episode of this season. So we decided, hey, let's just actually talk about it. And so it is here. We've got a big 90-minute conversation on that. So we hope you're here to listen to all of it, but you can also go into the time chart and hear the different segments, because that's still not all. At the end, after the Witch on the Holy Night segment, we'll also do a little wrap-up, look back on the fun times we had this season, and if you listen all the way to the end, we're going to tell you what's next on Japanimation Station, and it's exciting.
It is very exciting, yes. We have been doing planning behind the scenes for our next season, and yes, and there's good stuff ahead. But Jonathan, I'm hungry. You know, I haven't eaten yet. That's not true. I have eaten. That would be a bad idea to do a podcast on an empty stomach. For the sake of this bit, let's sit down for a meal over at the Emiya house, because this, as we talked about at the end of last podcast, this is a show I had forgotten was animated by Ufotable. I obviously knew it existed. I'd seen it before, but it did not enter my head originally when I was sitting down to think, what are all the Fate and Type Moon things adapted by Ufotable? And Emiya no Kyo no Gohan didn't pop into my head at first. And then about halfway through recording the episodes for this season, I realized, oh shit, that is animated by Ufotable. And thank God that it is, because it was a thing that I really did want to be able to touch on, at least something that was the broader world of Fate, because Fate Stay Night obviously is the core of the franchise, but you know, it is a big ass franchise that has dozens and dozens of spin-offs, both in the worlds of light novels, video games, manga, and anime. There's so much other stuff that exists outside of the specific story of Fate Stay Night, and a lot of them are also comedy focused. And Fate Stay Night is not a franchise I think you would expect on first blush to have such a wide-spanning sort of multimedia enterprise to it, and even specifically not just Fate Grand Order, but the characters of Fate Stay Night themselves having like other lives in comedy and slice of life style shows. So I'm very happy that we get to talk about Emiya no Kyona Gohan, because I think it's a nice way to wrap up this season, to just like touch the bigger world of fate that we are in now.
Oh, absolutely, because, I've been obviously looking at all the different spin-offs, and we could do a season of Japanimation Station at least as long, if not longer than this season, on just other shows in the Fate universe, with all of the Fate Grand Order shows, and with the, the Lord El Malloy II spin-off, and all of those. I mean, there's another one airing this summer, probably pretty soon from when this airs, the Fate Strange Fake show is coming out. The trailers for that have been amazing. That's A1 Pictures. So there's a ton, but obviously this is the right one, I think, for a couple of reasons to end the season with, both because it is an Ufotable Moon work, and because it is so tied into the characters that we know and love from the stuff we've watched this season, and I think from a lot of the themes that we really connected with in this year's episodes, about sort of the way there is this sort of found family that grows around Shirou Emiya, and, Saber really likes food, and everyone just comes over to Emiya's house all the time, and they made a show out of it, and it is, as you said early on, Sean, infinitely better than it has any right to be. Just unbelievable. I got to the end of the 13, which we should say it's 13 13-minute episodes, so they're half length. So it's a very quick watch. And I was sad there wasn't more. I wish this was a show that there was just a new episode every week of the year, because I would happily watch that.
Yeah, I hadn't watched these since they originally came out. And, I think I had forgotten I remembered it being good, but I had forgotten how good it is. Because it's a really delicate thing something like this has to do in order to be this good. Which is, it has to serve both, enough of the kind of inherent drama and lives of these characters to have them identifiably be the characters from the series, but it also has to lighten and brighten everything into that slice of life, what I would describe as an iyashike, which is iyasu is a Japanese verb to soothe or to relax. And so within the world of slice of life, the particularly kind of soothing and just sort of there's not a lot of plot. There's not that much sort of overt comedy. They're very light. That's kind of how I would describe today's menu for the Emiya family. And so being able to have that very lightness of tone and that very kind of happy, soothing atmosphere, while also being able to serve the characters in a way that makes it feel legitimate. It's not just a ridiculous spin-off, or it's not just any other slice of life thing. It is very identifiably about these people and their lives, even if it is, you can't square any sort of continuity or anything like that. You feel like they're the same characters in their core. I think that is a real feat that this show does, that is what puts it for me fundamentally at a really higher level than other things like this I have seen for other series.
And also, it is an Ufotable show. It has a very different aesthetic than Ufotable in any of their other work I've seen. I don't know if there's something that I haven't seen that has a similar aesthetic, but it's much more sort of painterly. It's much more handcrafted looking. It has much less 3D. It has this, very sort of delicate, almost kind of late period Ghibli-esque backgrounds, where you leave stuff kind of unfilled in, and you go for kind of softer colors and stuff like that. And I love that kind of aesthetic. I love it so much that when I watched the Hamburg steak episode, which to me is the highlight of this season, and we'll talk about it later, I stopped and started scribbling notes, because I think that episode might go in a chapter of my dissertation, which is crazy. Wow. But boy, I think I win some kind of prize if I work today's menu for the Emiya family into my dissertation, because that would be hilarious.
Yeah, I'm excited for the footnote to explain the existence of this show and what it is.
Yes. I know. But anyway, it is, I think, an animated marvel. It has the attention to detail that I think you associate with Ufotable. I think they went every inch as hard on the animation here as they did on any of the mainline shows. It's a very different context. There are almost no big fights. I think the volleyball episode, you could say, has a little bit of that feeling to it, but it does not have any of that stuff. But animating food is hard. We can talk about that later, and they do it as well as I've ever seen it done. And all the other little details, it is just an absolute animation marvel, in a very, different context. But I think it still has that Ufotable touch. You have all the voice actors getting to flex sometimes similar, sometimes different muscles than they have in other parts of the Fate universe. It's an absolute delight. It also has a theme song so ludicrously catchy called Apron Boy that I couldn't sleep last night because it was in my head. Like, it literally took me like an extra hour to get to sleep because I was just in my head going, dun, 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 Apron Boy, and just like singing that over and over to myself. It's driving me nuts. So we definitely need to talk about this show so I can like purge this from my system.
Yeah, no, it's I agree 100% with everything you said, including the insane catchiness of Apron Boy. I love this show to death. Let's talk a little bit about the background of it and kind of the context of where it comes from. So it's an adaptation from a manga by a mangaka who's T-A-A, Ta, capital T, capital A, lowercase a. I have no idea how it's meant to be pronounced. It is stylized that way when it's written in Japanese as well. So, the pronunciation, I think, is up to you of how you tackle that one. As far as I can tell, like looking around for credits, like the only thing I've ever seen this mangaka be credited for is this and other like one-shots and dojin and stuff like that related to Type Moon stuff. Like he worked on some like Tsukihime one-shots for like a dojin affair, some other Fate Stay Night stuff, some Fate Grand Order stuff. So I don't know if this is like an alias for another mangaka who's done other stuff or whatever, or if this is just like, this is like their main thing.
It's pretty common in like spin-offs like this, if you have someone who comes up from the doujinshi circle to use an alias like this. Like, to give another example, Dragon Ball Super, the manga version of that, is written by someone who was well known in doujinshi circles as Toible, and then on Dragon Ball Super their name is Toyotaro. We don't know their actual name. We probably never will. That's how this kind of thing tends to go.
Yeah, so I suspect that this is an alias for a mangaka that probably has done other stuff. I do not know. But it has been running since 2016, the manga. There are 8 volumes of it out. Like, it is still ongoing. I've read a little bit of the manga, and it is also very good. There's, 5 volumes are also published in English. So if you want to read it in English, there's some of it out there in English as well. And then, so it's, obviously, for it to be able to have 8 volumes and be ongoing in its serialization, like, the manga is quite good. It's got that like really fantastic art style that Ufotable does a really good job of translating into animation and all that stuff. And so I believe this originally actually kind of came about partially connected to an April Fool's joke. But ultimately, Ufotable decided to make an adaptation of it in a kind of unusual form. So this originally aired as an original net animation, or an ONA, not an OVA, because nobody puts things on videotapes anymore. But so these episodes were released basically once a month, starting from January 2018 to January 2019. So they're 13 episodes. Most of the episodes are also themed around whatever month that they were released in. That's why you have like a Christmas episode. You've got the Hinamatsuri or the Dolls Festival episode, stuff like that. So like each episode takes place in the season that it released in. And they're all 13 minutes, and they all are, at least of like from the manga stuff that I read, they are all adapted from single chapters from the manga, and the manga also has half-length chapters. So it is like a very kind of luxurious adaptation, because you're taking basically 13 pages of manga and adapting it into a 13-minute episode of anime. So obviously they do more to like flesh each story out and like really let each little kind of vignette fully breathe. And it was directed by Takahiro Miura, who was the director for Unlimited Blade Works, and then Tetsuto Sato, who is one of the key animation directors for Unlimited Blade Works as well. And then it's also, the music was by Shina Go, who he's like one of like the main Ufotable guys, and he's like the other composer on Kimetsu no Yaiba, along with Kazuyo Yuki, because the music is also like low-key a great part of this show, and yes. the weirdly epic theme that plays whenever they're finishing up a dish is just delightful, and it's slightly different in every episode. And I really like the one, I think it's like episode 3 or 4, where there's a bunch of taiko drums in it, and it's like really big and epic. But yeah, it's just a fascinating project, because it's taking this kind of low-key, kind of low-scale little manga that gets published in this magazine called Young Ace Up, and then turning it into this original net animation that is these half-length episodes aired over the course of an entire year. So obviously, they're not having the full staff, the same number of staff as would work on like a Kimetsu no Yaiba, but you are getting a lot more sort of like elbow grease into each individual minute of each individual episode for something like this. Which I think is really key for the series being as good as it is, because it allows it to have that really high quality animation. It allows them to have those like really high quality cooking sequences in particular, which, as you alluded to, Jonathan, like are very demanding on animators, animating food and stuff like that. It's like animating fucking mechs in a weird way, right? It's a similar like kind of complex geometric detail that you need to animate. And they do it so phenomenally well. And I think also the idea of let's just make, they're half-length episodes, but they're half-length episodes adapting little tiny manga chapters. So it's like each episode really gets to breathe and have this perfect sense of pacing, because they're not trying to jam in too much and get a full 26 or 23 to 26 minute thing. They're not trying to do 2 different story arcs per episode or anything like that. It's just like a very kind of focused, concise, very precise anime adaptation of what's a very pleasant manga. I think that's the unique form in which this series was produced is really key to how successful it is.
Yeah, I think you would tend to see with this, a manga formatted like this, you would tend to get normal length anime episodes that are doing like 2 to 3 segments per episode, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that would really, I think, kill the vibe of this show. Because I think the idea that every episode is one story, one dish, beginning, middle, end, very, delicately paced, that's what makes this so special. I think if you cut in the middle to another story or something, that alone would, I think, water it down in some way. You know what I mean?
Yes, yeah. It just allows every episode just really gets to be its own story. That it's its own little kind of nugget that you get to hold on to. And I do think, I wish there was more stuff that was formatted like this, because I think sometimes I see other animated adaptations of stuff like this, or animated adaptations of like 4-koma or like 4-panel manga that can end up feeling really weird because the pacing gets all over the place. Whereas just having this like very focused version of the adaptation that gets to have its own episode length, I think just like is a really smart way of adapting a manga like this.
Absolutely.
All right, so where do you want to go with this, Jonathan?
Okay, let's start with the point that you were making earlier and I was making earlier about animating food. This is something that has like fascinated me forever because I remember, so there is, in the Isao Takahata film, The Tale of the Princess Kaguya, his last film, there's this scene where they're cutting a gourd. And on the, they're using like a big kind of like bamboo chopping kind of knife to cut this gourd up. Mm-hmm. And in the making of documentary on that film, this is the documentary that's on like the G Kids DVD and Blu-ray here in the States, so you can find this. There's this long scene where Takahata is working with his animators because he's like obsessed with getting this gourd animation right. Because in one of his earlier films, I think it's Grave of the Fireflies, they're cutting into a fruit and he hated how it looked. And they go show that scene and you would never, just as a normal person watching Grave of the Fireflies, look at that and say that's bad animation. But when Takahata like walks us through it, the idea is that when they cut through this fruit, there's no resistance and it just looks like there's no weight to it. And that is how food is typically animated in anime and in animation all over the world. It's just actually dealing with the way that like a knife goes into food and the resistance you're going to get from that and the weight of all of that just isn't typically worth it to like the human eye will just kind of glaze over it if you kind of half-ass it, and so that's fine, right? But I remember it's a hilarious part of this documentary because of the obsessiveness with which they bring a bunch of like gourds into the animation studio and they're like taking knives and they're like doing it and studying it, and you've got animators all over. And I was just thinking about that throughout today's menu for the Emiya Family, because this is a well-resourced show. It is not a giant 2.5-hour Studio Ghibli movie, but it has a similar level of detail on like all the food in this thing. There are moments where like you have chopsticks going through meat, or you have, Shirou using a knife and cutting up onions and vegetables and meats, or you have, the way food is like simmering in a pot, or the way you kind of pick it up and the different kind of weights and resistances of all of that stuff. And it just blows my mind. The shot that most is crazy to me, I think it must be as complex a shot in terms of animation as anything we've talked about this season is in episode 11, when it's the one where you have Archer making food at the cafe, and he makes amu rice for Saber. And at the end of that, Saber gets the amu rice, and she takes her chopstick and kind of cuts along the top, and then it opens up, which is what that kind of omelet thing would do, and it fluffs itself out. That shot blew my mind. I can't believe it exists. It is such a complicated shot because, one, you have literally every frame as she's moving along, the omelet is like moving, because that's what food actually does. You cut part of it and kind of all of it kind of starts to move and has its own physics. And then the way the whole thing opens up, there's just something like that just as a piece of animation is so wild to see pulled off frame by frame. And this show has something like that in every single episode.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's part of the sort of key feature of the show. And obviously there's like a whole kind of subgenre of anime / manga that is like this, that are cooking focused. And so it's kind of its own little world. And even within that world, I haven't seen absolutely everything, but I've seen several shows like this. And this is definitely like near at the very top for me in terms of quality. Again, partially because they clearly you need the amount of time this show has per minute of animation in order to be able to do something like that. Because it's just, you need to get a really skilled animator and give them a lot of time to be able to animate, Kiritsugu cutting his, hamburg steak open with his chopsticks and stuff like that. Because they're also, all those shots are like big close-ups right in on the food. They're not there are no tricks. They're not like hiding anything or disguising anything or cutting away and then cutting back to a version of the food that has already been cut or whatever. They're showing you all of those details because it's a key feature of what the show is doing and what it is about. It is about how these people come together around these meals and connect over meals together. So it needs to be a thing that is a focus. It is also similarly it is the thing the manga is about. Like every chapter of the manga, at least if I read the first half of the first volume just to see what it was like. And those chapters end with a full page that is just the recipe for the food. So it's a very similar focus you get there. Or I also played a bit of the Switch game. I emulated the Switch game because I don't own a Switch. But every day, today's menu for Emiya Family, that game also has just a recipe view that feels almost as half the point of the game is just to have these interactive recipes that you can use to help you actually cook the meals. So it's such a focus of what this whole thing is about that you need to have that level of detail and intricacy for the sensory experience of the food, and getting to have that come across in the animation is really critical. And yeah, like you said, every single episode has something like that where you just kind of marvel at the amount of detail that's going on, how they have to animate every single grain of rice in the rice-based dishes and stuff like that, and how good and detailed all that is, the juices coming out of the meat-based dishes and stuff like that, the detail on how different kinds of foods are cut, or different ingredients are cut and react differently to being cut with a knife. It's so impressive. One of my favorite shots is in the caster episode where I forget what it is they're cutting, but she's cutting something in her hand and turning it and cutting each side of the thing off. And it's the detail of her fingers moving and the knife cutting through it is so intricate and so precise. And it really is an incredible feature of the show, just to enjoy the process of the food being cooked and admiring the visual kind of spectacle of it.
And I also enjoy just imagining the production process of this show, because there's no way they made this without bringing all of that food into the studio and studying it and drawing it and probably lots of it too, right? Not just one amu rice dish. They probably had to bring in several and be okay, let's cut this one. Now let's cut this one. Let's get another angle. Let's look at this. And of course, because you have to see it, you have to hold it, you have to understand the physics of it. That's the whole idea behind, again, they just, went that's why that scene from the Princess Kaguya documentary just sticks in my mind, is the idea that, Studio Ghibli spent a day around a set of gourds studying this for 5 seconds of animation. And there's a similar quality to a lot of this, obviously. But I think the corollary of that when we're talking about animation is that the character animation is also better in this show than it is in Fate Zero or Unlimited Blade Works. Like, there is more detail going on in the characters. There's more sort of frames. There's more like full facial and full body motion. Not because Unlimited Blade Works or Fate Zero are half-assing it. It's because they're full-length, 26 episode shows with 26 minute runtimes, and you just can't possibly give it the level of love and detail basically every second of this show has.
Yes. Yeah, and I in particular love the outfits in this show. Like, it's one of the things I also noticed with the manga. I think it's like a real strength of the manga is like all the characters' outfits look so good. Except like Shirou is the one who's kind of like left out of that because he's mostly wearing the one T-shirt he owns, his white T-shirt with the blue sleeves. Though he gets a couple of other outfits. They bring his jacket he got from Unlimited Blade Works and stuff. But particularly Saber's outfit, which is her kind of classic one that she gets from Tosaka in the original story, with like the white top and the blue skirt and stuff. It looks so good. And like the folds on the clothes and how it like hangs on her body looks so realistic and so precise. And it's true for everybody. Like Caster, her like outfit that she has, this is like her normal everyday outfit, looks so good. And it's like a weird part of the show that just like, it's so much better than other TV anime, partially because, the amount of time they get to put into it. But it's one of the things that makes it look like a movie is the way in which like the outfits feel like they're not kind of static elements of the character design that are just hooked onto the character. It feels like cloth that is draping over a person's body and reacts physically like that, in the same way that the food reacts with like appropriate physics and how it's animated. That is like one of those animation details I thought in this show that is just absolutely phenomenal.
Absolutely. And of course, because it's this story that is told over an entire year and you have the different seasons, you have a lot of costume changes for the cast. Which you don't have in Fate Stay Night because it takes place in a pretty compressed time period, right? So, Shirou and everybody, like, Tosaka Rin has basically her one outfit that you see in most scenes that she is in Fate. But here you get a lot of different things. You get all of their like swimsuits and stuff in the beach volleyball episode. You get their summer outfits. You get at Christmas, they're wearing fun stuff. It's just, all of that is great. And yeah, I did not expect, Sean, when you said, hey, Jonathan, we're watching today's menu for the Emiya Family. I fully expected it would be good. Like, it is an Ufotable production. It is this thing that I know people like. It will probably be fine. Not only did I expect it to not be this good on the level of like storytelling and everything, which we'll talk about in a minute, but I definitely did not expect the level of continuity and animation quality between fucking Heaven's Feel and these. It's so hilarious to go from like, because Heaven's Feel, at the end of Heaven's Feel 3 is when you get Ryder in like her everyday uniform for the first time with her glasses and her hair kind of up differently and all that. And then you get that fully throughout all these episodes, and her outfit and everything is so cool. And it was just kind of blowing my mind. Obviously, again, the animation style here is quite a bit different than Heaven's Feel, but the animation quality is basically on par, minus having, again, giant action scenes, but there are different kinds of challenges presented here. And I also just do love the more sort of bespoke, handcrafted kind of feel of the backgrounds and how soft those are. It's got a real nostalgic quality to it in like a positive way, I think, where it just, everything so looks like a drawing, and I think the character designs, like, they're done with sort of thinner lines. There's more sort of visible pencil in the designs. It looks more like a manga because that is what it's based on, right? And I think there is just there's a little more of that kind of individual personality in the art, which I love. And that is why, by the way, when I say this is going in my dissertation, the chapter I'm writing right now is this one that is very personal to me because it's just something I've noticed and talked about a lot, is this kind of increased sense of different anime in the 2010s, starting in like the late 2000s through the 2010s, that sort of embrace kind of a more handcrafted aesthetic, often for reasons kind of like this show does, of kind of being memory pieces or nostalgia pieces. And I think this one, particularly in the Hamburg steak one, where they abstract it even more in the past and they have even sort of more minimalist backgrounds and stuff like that. That's why this might go in that chapter, is it's just at that episode actually is just a very clean example of that idea in motion, because it is this literal memory piece about Shirou looking back on the first time he made this dish with his adoptive family. And so, all of that contributes to it too. It's a beautiful animation style.
Yeah, and it's got those really those softer, kind of more rounded character designs that they're all obviously very recognizable as those characters. But there's a like peaceful quality to the way they look and kind of happy quality to all the characters that is just like very pleasant. Like they're just fun to look at. The use of color is phenomenal. And then I particularly love, this is one of those things that feels nostalgic about the shows. I think specifically some of the things they do with the like on-screen effects when particularly Saber is eating anything. You know, half the premise of this show is just watching Saber eat things that are delicious. Like that's
Yes.
what the manga is basically about. That's like half of what the first chapter of the manga is, just watching Saber eat the hot pot dish and just like how happy she is eating stuff. That is the thing that you do with the game, is you just feed Saber different dishes and just see how happy she is. It's like that's the whole premise, really. And the little like effects they do on screen of like the flowers blooming and stuff like that, stylistically the way they do it feels so much like something you'd see out of a more old school anime. Like it feels like something you'd see in like Sailor Moon or something, just like with a more modern execution, but stylistically it feels kind of very classic. It's not exactly the way that other kinds of cooking shows I think like approach doing the on-screen effects. There's something intentionally old school about the idea of the more kind of almost pastel otherworldly little kind of aesthetic touches they put onto the screen when characters are enjoying their food.
You also get the kind of old school anime effect of there's a lot of the still frames that you kind of pan across and have moments like that, which is something you really Ufotable does not do a lot in their other stuff, but is much more of a, we've talked about this on Gundam, you know, Gundam will throw back to that a lot because that is a very 70s anime technique, so it's kind of part of Gundam's origin. And I always love that kind of thing. I think it's a cool thing that animation can do that like you literally can't do in I guess you could take a still photo and zoom in and pan across, but you don't see this in movies, in live action movies. In animation, you can do like a cool detailed drawing and just kind of pan on it. And I love moments like that as well, to kind of show the passage of time. So yeah, it's cool. I mean, I like seeing this from Ufotable because it is such a different style for them. And like it is stretching different muscles. And I just love seeing, you know, this is clearly one of the most talented groups of animators in the world, seeing them do something very different and, you know, much lower stakes also, you know. So the big animation challenge is not how do we have Tanjiro jump into the third dimension to do this giant spinning flame move and like jump through the forest. It's how do we have Saber enjoy some delicious roast beef on Christmas. I love that. And that must be fun as an animation studio to do like something so radically different.
Yeah, and it's like, and how do you communicate the sensory experience these characters are undergoing in a way that like communicates it really effectively to the audience? You know, it makes you feel that kind of like vicarious joy. Like that's like kind of the whole point of a series like this, is to make you feel like you're there with them in the room, enjoying the food, like enjoying that atmosphere. And the series is so good at executing on that vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I love what you said about like the point of this show is watching Saber eat different things, because it is basically like this is the story of how Saber gave up being King Arthur and worrying about England to just live with this Japanese boy and eat his delicious cooking. And I kind of love that. Saber has embraced her true self, which is a foodie.
Yes, and she's like the one character who doesn't cook. You know, it's like like everyone else is cooking. It's Saber just, you know, I forget which episode it is, but there's that one episode where she just looks like I think it's the Hinamatsuri one, and she just is very distraught because everyone else is in the kitchen. She's looking around the room, is like, well, what can I do? And then she's like, she goes, sits down at the table, it's like, I'll sit here and wait. I'll sit here and wait to go get Ilya. I was like, yeah, you do that, Saber.
Yes. Oh, man. And like we said, it's so fun to hear the cast do all of this. Like, Noriaki Sugiyama turns out maybe was put on this earth to read recipe instructions. Like, there is something about that man's voice doing this kind of like younger, I mean, not that Shirou is literally younger here, but it's a more sort of innocent, less, you know, angsty version of Shirou. And so it is just this happy, normal, everyday Shirou who's telling you in excruciating detail how to make these complicated dishes. And it turns out that is also one of Sugiyama's like greatest skill sets. Like, I want to hear him read every recipe to me. He's great at it.
Yes, although you do get the Archer episode where you get Junichi Suabe doing it. That like it literally sounds like you're like you somehow you're tuning into Japanese TV and you just turn to a cooking channel because it so sounds like an actual narrator, which is appropriate for Archer. But yeah, no, I think across the board all the actors do a really good job. And again, this is not the first time these actors have had to play the like happy everyday comedy versions of these characters. But this show is the most of those kinds of spin-offs. This one is the most laid back, the most relaxed. There are no zany antics in today's menu for the Emiya Family. It's not Carnival Phantasm, which is the other major animated spin-off, which that has like a Wacky Races episode. That one's like very kind of zany and all over the place. This is, broadly comic, but is very relaxed and very calm. And so, yeah, they have to occupy this kind of more minimal space in this very soft space with the voices for the characters while still making them feel like they're the characters, which all the actors do a great job at. Like I think in particular, Saber is one that I'm always really impressed at Kawasumi Aiko, being able to find that more comedic space because she's such a stern, stoic character in the main story that her having like the silly king who sits there and like has dinner served to her and stuff, and her reactions to like Lancer Caster showing up are incredibly funny. I think across the board, those actors all do a great job. But then, of course, you have like the one actor that has to do nothing different is the actress who plays Fujimura, Android 18.
Ito, yeah.
Yes, she just gets to do the same thing she does in the main show, which is like, I think in many ways, Taiga is like the heart of this to me because she is the one character who is the same in both timelines. Like, it doesn't matter what world you put her in, she is exactly that person, and I fucking love that to death.
I do too, and of course, there's way more of her than you get in the other Fate stuff.
Yeah.
Because this is where she shines. She is the freeloader who comes over to Shirou's house and gets food, and I love it. There's that moment in the theme song where in the song they go "Tadaima," and you have in the animation Taiga just run in and like be like, "It's Taiga, everyone," almost like their sitcom entrance.
Yes.
And it's like that to me is the spirit of the show. Is Taiga like jumping in, going "Tadaima," and then having food with everybody. It's beautiful. I think the actor who maybe benefits the most from getting to like stretch their legs here, though, is Lancer, Nobutoshi Kana. Like, yes. Lancer is so fun. He is like the surprise of this show to me because he's in almost every episode, often in a completely different role because he's just jumping from part-time job to part-time job. And, Lancer is such a great character in the main Fate universe, but he is one who's kind of doomed to have horrible deaths early on. And here, just like, that is such a fun performance. It's such a, like, I think like setting that character free, and they come up with so many funny stories for him. They also, I love that he is holding some kind of long object in every scene he's in. Whatever job he finds, he has something that vaguely looks like a lance, but it's great. Obviously one of my other favorite episodes, we've mentioned it already several times, is when he ropes Archer in to come cook for him at his cafe. It doesn't get better than that.
Yes, but I think maybe my favorite single moment, particularly in terms of like stuff that's not the more dramatic in the show, is in episode 2, which is the Lancer episode, when he comes over to their house, and then later Taiga shows up, and their reaction to each other, they're like, apparently he and Fujimura like are old buddies that have crossed paths in the shopping district or whatever before, and they just get up and like high five and go, yeah, and they're like linking their arms together and shit. There's the kind of like happy-go-lucky, just like, water under the bridge nature to Lancer's personality does definitely shine a lot, in seeing him just get to bounce off of all the other characters, and the fact that he just, every single episode he's working at some other weird part-time job, and as you say, he's always got some sort of pole or spear-like object vaguely connected to whichever job he's in. It is a weird highlight of the show that like they like really they focused in enough on Lancer that he has his own DLC. He's the only DLC thing in the game, which I couldn't get that DLC to work with my emulator, so I don't know exactly what that entails, but it makes sense that he would be the one character you'd be like, yeah, you need the Lancer DLC because he shows up a lot.
It's wonderful. Yeah, you could make a whole fucking video game out of his different part-time jobs. It'd be great.
Yes.
Assassin only shows up for one episode here, but I love that episode. It's where they make the sandwiches, which is one of the most like mouth-watering dishes that I think is made, is the fucking like the mixture Shirou makes for the sandwiches that he like sprinkles. It's just so good. But in that one, he leaves the plate of sandwiches out for Assassin, where Assassin is out obviously guarding the steps. I like that even in this like very utopian vision of Fate Stay Night, Assassin still is just tied to those fucking steps, but he seems okay. But that does lead to my single favorite shot in this 13 episode show, which is Assassin on the steps, taking a bite of the sandwich, and there's this like little camera move, and the wind comes in and flutters through his hair, and he just has this little line about how good it is and smiles. There's something, it is just a perfect little moment of animation, and it puts such a big smile on my face. That was like where I went from this is a cool show to I fucking love this show. Because that's like episode 3 or 4 or something.
Yeah, that's episode 4. Yeah, no, that one's really great. You also get in that one, you get something that's nice about watching this is you get some of these kind of extraneous kind of side characters that are, most of them are from Fate Holotraxia, the sequel to Fate Stay Night in the visual novel space. So that's where you get Otako, or the Neko, which is her nickname, the woman who runs the cafe that Shirou works a part-time job at. So you get her, you have like Issei's, I don't know if he's Issei's older brother or just like a monk that works there, but like the guy who takes care of Issei at the temple. So you get some of those kind of like supporting characters that are on the edges of Fate get to show up, which is fun. But yes, that episode is fantastic, and I particularly love the little bit right at the end where Caster shows up and asks her, like, are you, and like Shinichiro Miki's like incredible voice, like, are you going to make those sandwiches? And she's just like, what? Like, what?
Yes.
She has no idea, like, where this came from, or that Shirou is even there, and it just, like, cuts to black. Yeah, it's really good.
That's, I think, the only post-credits scene in the show, because there's a couple where the show runs through the credits, but other than that, if they use the normal credits sequence, it usually just cuts at the end. But that one, we get that extra, like, 20 seconds of the assassin asking about the sandwiches, which is so good. Yeah. No, I love it, and I know that, like, you're not supposed to think too hard about the continuity, but I do enjoy, like, I want to see the Fate Stay Night route that resulted in this outcome of the world, where everyone is just happy and eating together. Because you don't have Kotomine, Gilgamesh, or Zoken here, I imagine what happened here is that everybody realized they were the assholes, teamed up, beat the shit out of those guys, and then now they're just living happily ever after. That is my headcanon for how this works.
Yes, yeah, it is always, yeah, fun to imagine, because there's multiple spin-offs that are like this. It is like, because Fate Holotraxia is kind of a similar setup, although that actually does have a kind of weird explanation for how that timeline comes to be about. But yeah, it is fun to imagine, like, how the fuck how do all the various pieces fit together to end up in this scenario? Of course, you also, this show, you have, like, the weird thing of that it takes place over the course of an actual year, but nobody has aged, you know? Like, Shiro's not graduating high school. You know? It's like,
right.
You don't stop and think too much about, like, the eternal sort of year that these characters are all living in. I'm sure is exacerbated even more in the manga.
Speaking of Kotomine, though, I do have to say, I'm kind of bummed there isn't a Kotomine episode where he makes Mapo tofu and you have Nakata Joji walking you through doing the narration of how to make the spiciest tofu possible. That would be absolutely amazing. Or maybe an episode where Gilgamesh is won over and becomes their friend through the power of cooking. You know, that would be great too.
Yeah, I'm curious to read more, because I've enjoyed what I've read of the manga. I'm planning on continuing with it. I'm curious to see if those characters pop up. Because it is conspicuous. They're about the only major characters from Fate Stay Night that don't show up here. And it kind of makes sense that they're, like, a little bit harder. Particularly Kirei is a little bit harder to fit in with his relationship to other characters. But you could still do it. Like, he's still in some of the other comedy spin-offs. You could still have the Mabo Tofu scene, and I bet that probably does show up somewhere in the manga. It's too juicy not to do.
I will say, if I have one genuine complaint with this show, I do think it's weird that there's one episode where you have Shinji there and you have Sakura cooking for him. I think, I understand slice of life, alt universe comedy show, blah, blah, blah. You have Hiroshi Kamiya. He's great at this kind of thing. I do think that character should be off limits. I think it's too, when you have, especially like this show is being made as they're making Heaven's Feel, when you have a character who is a like literal rapist on screen in the canon, like it would be easier to have Gilgamesh here than it would to be Shinji. Like Shinji's villainy is too real. Like if you did the thing with the Mapo Tofu and Kotomine is such a goddamn cartoon at a certain point that you can do that and make it fun. I think Shinji it opens a can of worms that this show shouldn't be opening, and I think that is the one misstep where it feels like I wouldn't have touched that one personally. There's plenty of other characters to have fun with, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a thing where, like, Shinji has been put into that role enough times previously of like, it's one of those things that like you don't want to think too deeply about. We kind of like discussed a little bit on the Heaven's Feel podcast of like the alternate routes, like presumably all that stuff was still happening to Sakura in those routes, and the game, like obviously the game never addresses it because you wouldn't know about it when you're playing through those routes. But it is a thing where I think the series likes to just kind of like pretend like these kinds of spin-offs to try to pretend that, oh, that's like just that timeline or something that happened. Like, and I agree with you. It never works for me. Like, I just feel like Shinji's too hard of a character to try to rehabilitate or like just make you ignore that stuff happened. Like I don't like the little bit at the end of the Unlimited Blade Works anime. I didn't really mention it that much because you didn't have the context for it yet. But there's that one scene of Sakura and Shinji in the hospital, and I don't like that scene. Like I don't want to see those characters at all. And obviously, in the context of that story, the audience wouldn't have any idea any of that other stuff, and so whatever. But for me, yeah, I don't like when in different adaptations or different storylines or whatever don't like sort of feel like they're built understanding that history is there if you have played the Heaven's Feel route.
Right, yeah. I think it's just, again, when you have a cast this big and with this many pieces, it also just feels unnecessary. You could give that 2 minutes to anybody else, and there are other villains that you could have fun with because, again, they're larger than life. The problem with Shinji is that he's very specifically not larger than life. He's like a very real thing that we're dealing with. Kotomine is not analogous to things people will actually encounter in the real world. Shinji, sadly, is. Small thing, and as you say, it is not like this is the only show that did that in the Fate universe. But that's how it goes. Yeah. What other characters worth mentioning here? I mean, everyone's fun. Ilya, I think I will always take more Ilya. Her scenes are great. You have, I think it's the penultimate episode is the Christmas episode, and at Ilya's castle. That is delightful, because not only do you get more Ilya, you also get her two servants, and you have Berserker come in. I was worried for a little bit. In my headcanon, Berserker had died in my route, like defeating Gilgamesh, and that is how this route came about. But then we turns out Berserker did live. He's out cutting down the Christmas tree, and Ilya had made these little iced cookies for him, and Sakura's was very nicely done, and Ilya's was very messily done, and it made me laugh very hard.
Yeah, and there's that shot in the end credits of the last episode where you see Berserker and Ilya making snowmen together outside, which is fucking great. Yeah,
it's so good.
Yeah, Ilya is definitely like one of, I think, like the focal characters in the show. It feels like she's the main focus of multiple episodes, and particularly episode 3, which is the Hinamatsuri one. I think episode 3 for me is the first one that you hit there. I'm like, oh my god, this episode is really good because of how well it captures Ilya's character, where she's a good example of what the show does, of where it lightens everything into that slice of life tone, but it doesn't sort of like cut off all of the edges. So there's still a kind of coldness or aloofness that Ilya has in certain moments that feels very like true to her character. And I think that episode also acknowledges something about Ilya, which is that she's not Japanese, right? So she's a foreigner. She's from Russia. So they like are doing the Dolls Festival thing, which is a traditional festival for young girls in Japan. And they're doing that for her to kind of like integrate her more into the family, which I think is a really smart touch to like, one, because it's connected to the dish that they make, which is a traditional dish for that holiday. But it also connects very specifically to Ilya's character and gives her character a little arc over that one episode that feels like it really connects to who she is and her origins in the show and everything like that. And so it is not sanded off every edge to where every corner of the universe is just like perfectly happy and pleasant and nice. There are some things where like, there are some rougher edges that characters need to sort of grow from or deal with, or like, negative emotions they have to encounter. And that is the first episode that really kind of fully integrates that into the narrative. And Kadawaki Mai, who plays Ilya, I think does such a great job, because Ilya is a character who is all over the place in all the spin-offs. And there's so many different like versions of Ilya. You have the Magical Girl show that Prisma Ilya, which she's in, where she's kind of the main character, but that's from a world where she's like grew up as a normal little girl.
Wait, what? I haven't found this one yet. That's amazing. Yeah,
that show, there's stuff about that show that it is not the easiest show to recommend, but there's stuff about that show. I don't want to get into detail with right now, but But there's that Elia. You've got, obviously, the main series Elia. You've got Elia, who is student or pupil number 1 in the, like, if you get the bad endings in a Fate's Day Night, then she shows up with Taiga as this weird, like, kind of comic performance to explain why you died and what to do to try to avoid dying. There's Carnival Phantasm Elia. Like, that character is used in so many different ways for so many different registers, from dramatic to comedic, that there's something I've always find very impressive about Kadawaki Mai's performance, that she's able to really dial it in to exactly what register, how... Like, do you need how over the top does it need to be? How, like, soft does it need to be? How dramatic does it need to be? And I think where she lands with the performance here is like really quite close to the performance in the original series, but just a little bit softer. But she doesn't go into the more kind of high comedic territory that she does in some of those other spinoffs. Like, she's like, you know, super comedic in that Magical Girl show. And she doesn't ever go to that space. So I'm always impressed with how far in, like, what the dynamic range she can bring that character as.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that just speaks to, like, exactly what you said, because I think this is true for most of the characters, where it does feel like this is clearly different than Fate's Day Night, but it's kind of a matter of degrees, not a matter of an entire shift. And that is why you can have the fun of, like, okay, make your own little headcanon of how this is the fourth happy route, but it is still, like, from that same story. You can totally do that with this show. And I think that's, like, surprising to me, because normally this would be, I think, quite a bit broader and more arch, and this is not that. It really does, as you say, feel like identifiably this is those characters. You know, like the finale goes for very much kind of making literal a theme that is there throughout this entire series, which is that this is a family that has come together. This is, you know, it's today's menu for the Emiya family. And even though none of these people are related by blood except Sakura and Rin, who are, due to circumstances, don't even have the same last name, they have all become a family here in Kiritsugu's big, warm, loving house. And, like, that is this really cool, beautiful thing that has happened. And, you know, food is this, like, very real thing that they all bond over. And I think, you know, all of that is from Fate's Day Night. None of that is something they've made up here. These are themes that are obviously enhanced. Shirou is more of a foodie than he is in Fate's Day Night, but he is like a obsessive cook a little bit in Fate's Day Night. Like, that is clearly a hobby of his. He is good at it. You know, Saber does love to eat in Fate's Day Night. She loves it even more here, but it's none of this is stuff that they're making up out of nothing. It all feels true to the characters.
Yeah, I think in particular, because we talked about all the, like, kind of side characters, but we haven't actually talked that much about Shirou. It is one of the things that's fascinating about Fate's Day Night as a story. And I'm currently, like, about halfway through the Fate route in the game, which I've been playing again. And it's, like, even more obvious in the game than it is in the show, of the, like, him cooking and him cleaning the house and him taking care of this giant manor alone and having to have done that all himself. Like, it is a big focus of particularly the first third or something of each of those routes before the action goes crazy. But even when the action goes crazy in the game, you know, it is based on, like, days. So it's not usually cutting huge chunks of time. So it's like most days in the game, he has to go make food. He has to go, like, oh, who's going to make dinner tonight? Is it me or Tosaka? Like, what are we going to have for lunch? Like, oh, I made a bento. Like, it's, you know, it's a thing that he's constantly doing and thinking about. And it is something that separates Shirou from other characters like him, other protagonists. And it's a kind of distinguishing feature for him as a character, I think, is that he, like, has this, what is, like, a traditionally, like, more feminine role of the, like, caregiver and, like, the house taker, right? They're house carer. Like, he cleans everything, he cooks everything. He's the one who, like, is the most responsible within that group, because he's had to more or less raise himself. Because even when Kiritsugu was, like, had adopted him, Kiritsugu spent most of his time abroad. So even in that period of time, Shirou was still the one actually taking care of the household and having to cook his own meals and stuff. And I think it's something that is really interesting about his character to me, is that it is such a focus for him, enough so that it feels completely natural that there's a cooking show spinoff. Like, it doesn't feel like a stretch. It doesn't feel weird that you would go here with this series, in a way that for most series, it would be really bizarre. You know, you're not going to have the, like, Naruto cooking show spin-off. You're not going to have fucking Goku's not going to be making sandwiches for anybody. It's just not the thing that the protagonist character usually does. You would maybe have a side character, like Sanji in One Piece or something, but it's not usually the main character who is also the caregiver, who's doing all the household chores. But it is a big focus of Shirou's characterization in the original game, and in the anime, obviously, it's also focused on as well. Enough so that you could have an entire show that is based on that idea. Like, it's really notable to me when you play the game that that in a way, the fantasy of the game is you're playing as Saber, Sakura, or Dean, and you are helping Shiro make dishes, and he is the one who's teaching you how to make the dish. So from a certain perspective, the fantasy that the game is expressing is you being able to make food with Shiro, and he's not the playable character. He's the chef who's teaching you how to make stuff, and you're like the girl coming over to be taught by the cute boy that you have a crush on, basically. Like, that's kind of, in a weird way, the perspective of the game. And then when it comes to eating the food, then the focus is more on the girl character. But when you're making the food, the focus is entirely on him. And that's obviously true of the show as well, because he's the main person making the dishes in almost every episode. And I think it's just a unique feature of this series that I love, and a unique feature of Shiro as a character that really gives him an identity and a texture that is quite different from other protagonists in this kind of series.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's funny you say that with, like, other shows, because it is like, you get this sometimes, like Sanji in One Piece, there is a whole set of like recipes that have come out. I have some of the One Piece magazine releases. They have a bunch of those. I think a cookbook has come out of all of like Sanji's recipes and stuff, but there isn't, and I don't think there will be, the show where it's like Sanji cooking for the Straw Hats for 13 episodes. Although that might be entertaining, there is something about this that just feels like such a natural, obviously, yeah, do the Shiro. Because I think if you are imagining, Heaven's Feel, what happens with Shiro and Sakura in a world where they are together and a little more well-adjusted and all of that after that story, I imagine it looking not too dissimilar from this in terms of Shiro probably doing a lot of cooking, because clearly he likes that and it brings him fulfillment. Like, it is, it is a healthy way I think he has dealt with some of the like isolation and challenges of his life, is this kind of caretaking. And it is something he is good at and brings him joy and brings the people around him joy. And so I like imagining a future where Shiro spends a lot of his life doing cooking for people, because it's fun and it's cool. And I love that. And it makes this show feel meaningful, not just like a fun, silly what if.
Yeah, and it's such a feature of the show that it's like even the theme song is named after him, right? He's the apron boy, and when the chorus comes on, that's when Shiro gets like puts on his apron and he's like posing with all of his cooking utensils. There's just something about it that it highlights that feature of his character that I just adore. That he's kind of like breaking some of that kind of like the gendered stereotypes for a character like this, and it's really cool.
Yes. About all the recipes, I want to talk about some of these, because obviously, I don't know about you, I was definitely watching this one with an eye towards, I'm going to fucking make some of these at some point, because these sound great. Some of them I'm never going to be able to make because I do not have a kitchen this well stocked. And some of them involve like having a deep fryer and things like that I do not have. But like the second episode has the one where they make the foil baked salmon. And I was like, that would be so easy. That's a great idea. And there were a couple of those over the course of this where I was like, that sounds really cool. And then there were some where I'm like, that looks really hard, and you would have to have a ridiculously well-stocked kitchen to make this because of all the things Shiro is adding in. But I had a lot of fun just watching the different recipes and feeling like taking mental notes on it.
Yeah, I mean, I am not much of a cook, so that is not quite the dynamic I watch the show in. I enjoy the process. Like, I enjoy the seeing the like step-by-step breakdown of it, and then particularly because it's Japanese, like a lot of the food is stuff that like I'm not specifically familiar with, so it's interesting to see the like some of the different cooking styles and stuff. Or you get like when Tosaka's episode where she does her like Chinese style cooking with the gomoku rice. I'm a terrible cook, so I would probably not try to make any of these dishes, but I like seeing the process of them being put together.
Yeah, I like cooking. It's something I rarely have the time or money to do, like certainly in the depth that Shirou is doing here, but I'm always wanting to do more. And this definitely was inspiring to me. Also, it made me a little sad to not, because I've been to Japan, I've had a lot of these kinds of dishes over there, and it made me a little bummed out that I can't just go. It was particularly, it's the one where he makes karage, fried chicken for the student council. And karage was my favorite thing I ate in Japan when I was there. There's something special about it. Calling it fried chicken, it's so different than American fried chicken. And it's so delicious, and you can get it, I had it at like real restaurants that, made it fresh. And I also there was a 7-Eleven down the street from Thomas's apartment, and I would often just go there a couple times a day to get a stick of karage, because they sell it in the convenience stores, and even the kind of just convenience store karage on a stick is absolutely delectable. It's so good, and that one just made me jealous, because I'm like, God, I want karage again. And the nice thing about being in Japan is you can go get it very easily, but like that kind of fried chicken obviously is not just something you can go into like, a Come and Go or something. Just to be clear, that's an actual chain in the Midwest. It is not me making a joke. And pick something like that up. So, yeah.
Yeah. But then the other thing with the cooking is that they do, like that, the Karage episode is a good example of where the food is themed really intelligently around the plot.
Yep.
Right? Like the whole idea of that one is it's something he can make really quick that like he can go give to this big group of people. That's like an easy, quick thing for them to eat that has like a bunch of protein and stuff. And then even if it goes cold, it'll still be good, right? As leftovers. And I always liked that as well, to see how do you tie in whatever the meal is, because some of them it's very obvious because it's like, oh, this is, the first episode is Toshikoshi Soba, it's on New Year's, like it's an obvious choice for like the traditional dish. But then some of them, they have to be a bit more creative about how do you tie in what is going on here with what's happening either with the characters or in the plot of the episode.
Yeah, I already mentioned the spring vegetable and bacon sandwiches. Those looked fantastic. One of the other ones that I loved is the bamboo shoots gratin, where they have this like big set of bamboo shoots they have, and they're like, okay, what are we going to do with these? And Shirou, I think it's isn't it like that Sakura has bought the stuff to make gratin herself, and Shirou has the bamboo shoots, and they're like, well, let's put these together. And man, I would love to try that. That looks great. I don't think I've ever eaten anything with bamboo. Maybe a little bit while I was in Japan, but because it has I do think I have, because I can imagine the texture of it. I think I've had that a little bit, but not something exactly, because the whole theme of that episode is that's an unusual dish they've put together, and it looks great.
Yeah, no, I mean, all the food looks so good. I think probably the omelet rice was the thing that was most impressive to me in terms of, like, just, it looked unbelievably delicious. That was probably, like, the most delicious looking dish in the whole show to me.
The other thing about that is Archer went so over the top with it. Omelet rice is known as something that's pretty simple to make, like with leftovers in the house. Like that's like its main use is that you have extra rice from the night before and you break them with a couple eggs. It's like, it's literally usually done with like day-old rice or something because it's a little easier to use cold. But he goes crazy. He makes that whole tomato mixture. He's doing the special ketchup, all that stuff. And it does indeed. It's like gourmet omelet rice and it looks amazing.
Yeah, and that's, that episode in particular I think is a good example with the characterization of where there's something very heartwarming about seeing Archer, this vision of the future where Archer just gets to basically be a professional chef, right? Like, it's clear that he is better at this than Shirou. He's an adult. He's the future version of Shirou. And that, that the life Archer had led up to that point has not allowed him to indulge in this, but at his heart, he still is Shirou. Like, he still wants to clean, he still wants to cook. And that's a thing that, you get little hints of in the original story as well, that he is good at those kinds of household chores. It's just he doesn't actually do it that much. And seeing him, this idea of him basically just being a professional chef for this cafe is so appropriate, and like how good he looks with the outfit on and everything. And he gets so absorbed into it that he forgets that he was supposed to go meet Tosaka, who shows up with her big hat or whatever as a disguise. That's like a real highlight episode for how it sort of plays off of Archer's characterization, and really kind of there's an emotional core there that I think is quite effective.
Absolutely. I love the whole thing where Tosaka comes in disguise just to watch him cook, and then he realizes he's been cooking for like 3 more hours than he intended to because the time got away from him. And yeah, I do like imagining that this is a world where Archer could just go be a chef if he wants to. That's pretty good. That's especially given the shit he goes through in Unlimited Blade Works. I like this. This is a good future for him.
Yeah, or he could trim the hedges in Tosaka's much more elaborate garden than I think you ever realized. Like, at the beginning of that episode, he's just there, like, trimming the fucking hedges in what looks like basically a hedge maze. And I'm like, I guess you see that. I guess you do see that in Fate Zero, right? That's like when Assassin attacks the Tosaka Manor. You do see a giant garden, but it's not a part of the house you normally ever see. So first, like, where the fuck is he? Is he like a botanic museum or some shit? Like, what is going on with these massive hedges? Oh, I guess it's in the back garden of the Tosaka Manor. It's a lot more expansive than you think when you look at it from the outside.
You see more of the Tosaka Manor in this show than you do in Fate Stay Night. It's hilarious.
Yes.
You get a bunch of scenes around it, and you also see it looks almost identical in some ways to the manor in Witch on the Holy Night, the Kuonji Manor, which made me laugh a little bit. Like, because, I mean, and clearly it's a similar idea in both stories, but yeah, there's a very similar, like, layout and use of space and architecture.
Yes, and thinking of the Tosaka episode where you get, like, you know, the spring cleaning basically or whatever with Sakura and Shirou over there, that's also where you see Tosaka cook. And you also see this in all the opening theme animation. But Tosaka looks so fucking good with the ponytail.
Yes.
I was like, that's also the thing, and they do this in the game as well. Whenever you're with Neen and she's cooking, she's like, her animation for when she goes to start cooking is she puts her hair into the ponytail. And it's like, holy shit, that is good. But it's like, there's something like very powerful about Tosaka with the ponytail that I'm way into.
Yeah, I think there's a shot of the two of Rin and Sakura, like, with their aprons on in the theme song.
Yes.
That I think is, like, I want, like, a poster of that. It's such a fun, like, picture and drawing of the two of them ready to, like, go cook. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
But yeah. Another dish I love in terms of its theming is, this is from the episode where they go to the water park, and for a while I'm like, how is this going to connect to cooking? Because that's the one where they do the silly volleyball game and everyone gets crazy competitive. I thought for a second there in that one that Saber was going to rip off her little hair thing and, like, turn Saber Alter to win the game. They don't go that silly with it. That's not this show. Yeah. But you have all of that, and then they're really exhausted at the end of the day, and so that's when Shirou makes the, like, chilled food. He does the chilled green tea over rice and all of that, and that one is also a dish that looked amazing to me, because I definitely haven't had something exactly like that, where it's all, like, cold themed, and that looked cool.
Yeah, and that episode is a ton of fun. Like, the whole part where Tosaka and Saber go down the massive water slide or whatever, and how, like, 110% into it Saber is incredibly adorable.
I know. I love Saber in this mode, because you get her like this in a couple of scenes in Fate Stay Night where, like, the weight of the world is off her shoulders and she doesn't have to worry any of that stuff, and she's just kind of a goofball at heart, and I kind of love that. I love that little piece of her characterization, that if it weren't for all the Arthurian, you know, pressure of the world, she's just a goofy kid, and it's great.
Yeah, and Tosaka's whole thing of, she's like, you know, no, man, when you go to have fun, like, you gotta put your whole heart into it, which is very true of her character, right? That, like, when they show up and she's having such a good time at the water park, and she's like, what do you do? Like, you're going crazy. It's like, no, when you're having your day off and you're having your outing, like, you gotta really commit to having fun. It's like, that is absolutely something you could, like, Tosaka would say in the original story as well. Like, it's a very clear through line there with her characterization.
Yep. So I think I said earlier, my favorite episode overall was the Hamburg steak one. Yes. That is where we get a flashback, and it's very focused on Taiga and Shirou and little boy Shirou. So we have the actor who plays young Shirou is there too for one episode. What's that actor's name? It's Junko Noda plays young Shirou. And you have, so that performance, it's very cute. You have obviously a very delectable, you know, dish that is made with the first Hamburg steak. You have a good scene with Kiritsugu. It's just a great little flashback. It's a kind of episode that you can just very easily add into the canon for yourself, because it's this past where they were all living together. It's a great Taiga showcase episode. It's just, I think, a perfect little 13 minutes of animation, and I particularly love how it kind of plays with the animation style for the sort of extra layer of nostalgia and memory that's going on here. Yeah, no, I think episode 6 is clearly the best episode of the bunch. It's really powerful, and as you say, it's one that you can easily imagine just, like, actually having happened in the original series.
Yeah, and it's so effective. The whole like frame narrative that gets you into it of them going like Shirou and Taiga getting the laundry or whatever because it's being rained on, and that bringing you into the flashback of that happening in the past. And seeing this like high school aged Taiga who is voiced by Hisako Kanemoto, Squid Girl herself, is little girl Taiga, or not little girl, but high school girl Taiga. And having her walk around with Shirou as Shirou is buying all the ingredients, and you see her that she's like, in her own silly way, like she really loves him and is like looking out for him and making sure that he's going to be okay and following him along on these errands as he's going to make this hamburg steak for Kiritsugu, and then Kiritsugu coming out and eating it. And then what his line at the end of the flashback is like, I can't wait to see how you'll grow up, basically. And that cutting into Shirou in the modern day. It's an incredibly powerful story. It's the best example of that they are not shaving off all of the edges in trying to make it a slice of life thing, is that, this is a thing that is completely maintained from the original, that like Kiritsugu died. Like he's gone, and like the impact that he had on Shirou's life is enormous. But you're not like ignoring the whole of that Kiritsugu has left behind, which would be very easy to do. And obviously, this is the only episode in which he directly comes up. But so they're not just like ignoring it, or they're not trying to do something where it's like, oh, he never died, and he's like he's just out traveling the world or something, which some of the like other spinoffs have done. It was like, he gets to still be out there somewhere, but we're just not making him an active character because he's kind of too hard to deal with in that way. And just maintaining the actual canon of the original story and using that as kind of this emotional leverage to be able to tell this story about how Shirou kind of grew up into the person that he is, and in many ways where his cooking fascination came from. It is from him both taking care of himself, but also taking care of Kiritsugu, because in reality, for most of the time that Shirou and Kiritsugu were actually together in that manner was when Kiritsugu was like more or less on his deathbed, right? For the rest of the time, Kiritsugu was spending most of his time overseas, and so it's only like when he was close to his death and he couldn't go anymore, that was like the longest amount of time Shirou and Kiritsugu had together. And so the fact that, he needed to take care of him, Shirou needed to take care of Kiritsugu as well, is part of what makes him who he is as a person. I just think that episode tells that story so beautifully.
Absolutely. It's indispensable. I think if you watch nothing else from today's menu for the Emiya Family, that episode should just kind of be required viewing if you are into Fate Stay Night. It is such a beautiful piece of the story. But all of it is. This is there are a million Fate Stay Night spinoffs, obviously, Sean. You picked this one for a reason, and I think this is one that just, if you like this story, this is a no-brainer. This is a slam dunk. This is not every comedy spinoff of a show you love will be good. This one is one that feels like essential viewing, and that's crazy to me because it is the foodie cooking spinoff thing.
Yes.
But it's just is such a natural fit. It's done so beautifully. Everything about it works.
Yeah, and it's the crazy thing about the Fate franchise is that this can work so well. Like, obviously it takes a high level of like execution for it, but that like there's even the slot in the franchise for this to like go into is just like fascinating to me, like how natural an expansion of that world and those characters that today's menu with the Emiya Family really does feel like. There is also the game. I'll speak to that a little bit because I did play a little bit of that. You should not pay $50 for that game because that is way too much money. But having played some of it on the emulator, and I probably will actually finish that out because it doesn't seem super long. But if you could get that thing for like $15 to $20, it's also a good time. Like it's also if you liked this, like the manga is good, that game is good. Again, not $50 good, but it is fun. So it's like there's a whole world of today's menu at the Emiya Family to be enjoyed that isn't even just this show. Which I had not touched before I wanted to do some of it for this podcast, and I'm very much going to finish reading the manga, and I'll also probably continue to play some of that game and feed Saber more delicious meals.
I'm definitely going to read the manga. I want to play this game. I want to play it very badly, but it is $50, which seems nuts to me. I'm not sure who's paying that much for it. It's not a $50 kind of game, but it does look very delightful. And so at some point, it is on my Nintendo Switch wishlist, and it's kind of like Steam. They let you know when it goes on sale. So if that ever gets a sale, I will pick it up. And maybe I will get the Lancer DLC as well, Sean, since you couldn't comment on that.
Yes, I'm curious. I am very curious. I have no idea what the fuck that Lancer DLC is. Do you play as Lancer? Does he replace Shirou in the episode? Like, it would be hilarious if, like, the characters you play as are Tosaka, Saber, Sakura, and Lancer. Those are the 4 characters you get to play as. Would be the funniest thing in the world to me.
And also, just again to mention, the theme song is so great. Apron Boy. Yeah. There was the level of joy because I think the title of the song comes up right before in the song they say, Apron Boy. And me reading it out and like sounding out the katakana and going, Apron Boy, what is that? And then hearing it and going, Apron Boy. Oh, it's Shirou. He's the Apron Boy. Just the smile on my face when I realized they wrote an entire song called Apron Boy for Shirou. And it is so goddamn delightful. And it ends with everyone singing Itadakimasu. It's so good.
Yes, and I do also have to shout out the band name for the band for Apron Boy is DJ Misoshiro and MC Gohan. For people who don't know, Misoshiro means miso soup. Gohan means meal and or rice. And I thought at first when I saw that this must be a fake band name that they just made for this thing for this. No, that's a real band. Like there's a whole food themed band that exists that is these 2 people, DJ Misoshiro and MC Gohan. And I don't know if they already had the song Apron Boy, if they contracted them to make the song Apron Boy. But they have like multiple albums and they're like food themed based on what I saw. So there's a whole world out there. And then also let's shout out the ending theme, which is Collage by Sangatsu no Fantasia, which is also really great. I particularly love the opening bit that kind of leads you out of the episodes, is very nice and very like adds to that kind of very nostalgic quality. I think Apron Boy is the star of the 2, but Collage is also a great song.
Collage is great, and I wanted to shout out, when I went to find that song on Apple Music, I found the album it's from, which is an album by Sangatsu no Fantasia called Girls Blue Happy Sad, which is just an amazing name for an album. That's a great album. I was listening to that this morning while I was walking my dog. Every single song on that album sounds like it's the theme song to a different slice of life anime. Some of them probably are, I don't know. I didn't look it up, but it's a fantastic, like if you just want happy, bubbly energy, it's a great album that comes from. And again, great title for an album. So yeah, all around, this show kicks ass. It makes me want to eat. It makes me want to cook. I love it.
Yeah, I do really wish they would make more. You know, there's a lot more of that manga you could adapt. Like, come on, Ufotable. I know you're probably busy making your, movie adaptation of Wish on the Holy Night, and you're making your Kimetsu no Yaiba and everything. But you can pencil this in. Come on, give me some more Today's Menu at the Emiya Family.
I'm glad we at least have this. I will always take more, but this is a pretty perfect 13-episode little spin-off, and I'm very glad we watched it.
Yes, I'm thrilled that I remembered that this was made by Ufotable, like against all odds, because it is totally unique as far as I could tell within their oeuvre. There is nothing quite like today's menu at the Emiya Family. So,
yeah, absolutely. I love even like you talked about, the music is done by Shina Go or Go Shina, and like you look at his credits, it's hilarious. It's, Tales of Zestiria, God Eater, Dimension W, Fate Grand Order. Today's Menu for the Emiya Family. I love, like, that is such a funny list of credits leading up to Today's Menu for the Emiya Family. But he, like, approaches it with, like, the same energy. It's got, like, as you say, like, the music in, like, the big cooking scenes is, like, big action music. I could imagine Tanjiro fighting a fucking demon to that. It's great.
Yeah, it's like the big, like wow hit that they all end on feels like, oh yeah, Tanjiro just like, it's just a slightly happier version of the sound you'd hear when Tanjiro cut a demon's head off or something. Yeah, it's very funny to me how good and how kind of appropriately epic the score is in a weird way for the cooking scenes.
Yep. All right. Well, that is today's menu for the Emiya Family. Sean, should we throw it over to our second topic in today's supersized episode, Witch on the Holy Night?
Yes, so this is a topic. We actually have pre-recorded this podcast. We were already pre-recording the conversation that we just had based on when people hear it, but we even pre-recorded this from when we finished it. So if any Weekly Stuff listeners, if you listened to our 2022 Game of the Year podcast, we recorded this conversation around then because it was relevant, because it came up on that podcast as well as one of the best, probably it's a video games of that year. And yeah, so this is Witch on the Holy Night. Like I said at the end of last podcast as well, if you have not played the game and you have not played that visual novel, we do go through the whole plot at the beginning of this conversation. So if you want to be able to listen to the conversation but don't know what the plot of that game is, because obviously it's a big, long visual novel, it's not quite like all the anime stuff we've watched, you can still enjoy the conversation if you're interested in doing that. And I wouldn't worry about spoilers because it's not a spoilerable kind of story anyways. So I think you could enjoy us talking about it and then play the game later if you decide to as well. So go ahead and listen and enjoy our conversation. This is Witch on the Holy Night. All right, Jonathan, so let's go ahead and get into Mahoutsukai no Yoru, also known by its English language title, Witch on the Holy Night.
I'm excited. This is a segment that willed itself into being, not a part of our original plan for Japanimation Station Season 2, but we were playing this game. It just happened to come out as we were starting production on this season in English in December. And we were playing it the whole time, and it is such an important text to the entire Nasu-verse. We wound up mentioning it so many times during the episodes you've heard this season. We had to do at least, today's episode is not going to be comprehensive because I think you would need a couple episodes to really dive into this whole thing, but we want to do at least some justice to it as it pertains to all the other conversations about Ufotable and Type Moon that we've had, and also Ufotable will have a movie based on this in the near future.
Yes. This is something I'm actually curious about, is if it's because they haven't clarified if it's going to be one movie or more, because having played the game, I think this is a very clear 2-movie structure, and I do not know how you do this in one movie, but
I think you could. I think you could do it in one movie in so much as it depends on whether or not you see the mid-plot turn of what happens at the amusement park as the end of Act 1 or the end of Movie 1. I think that's that's how you would have to think about it.
But yes, either way, whether it's going to be one movie or multiple movies, there will be a movie on it as well, and that will fully fit into the Ufotable Moonworks.
Yes.
So we'll have like a special Gaiden episode or something in the pod of season 2 to do when that comes out.
Indeed. But Sean, for people who maybe have not played Witch on the Holy Night but would still like to hear us talk about it, let's go through the plot. And I found this is a website called sukikan.com. And I just we're going to use their plot summary. We're going to read it out to you, both to refresh us, because for us it's been a couple weeks since we played this, and also just to set a baseline. Here is what happens in the game. And if you have not played the game yet, maybe you can just get a background here. I don't think this is a game that can super be spoiled in that sense. I think it is a thing that even if you knew the plot going in, which I know you did, Sean, it is so rich. It's not really about plot twists. So we're going to read that out. If you don't want to have it spoiled, go play the game and come back later. But let's read the plot summary out, and then we will go through it, Sean. I'll start here with what is in chapters 1 and 2, and then you can take over after that. The story begins with a flashback to Aoko Aozaki's childhood when she accidentally killed a family of cats hiding in her father's car's engine. She asked her grandfather to revive the cats, but her grandfather is unable to do so. Fast forward to the present in the late 1980s, Aozaki Aoko is living with Kuonji Alice in a large mansion on top of the hill of Misaki Town as she studies under Alice to become a mage. During the day, they both live normal lives as high school students. Aoko, the student council president, is asked by her homeroom teacher, Yamashiro, to show the school to a new transfer student named Shizuki Sojuro. Despite her annoyance and unreasonable anger towards Sojuro, Aoko does her job. The next few days focus on the daily lives of Aoko, Alice, and Sojuro. Sojuro, having lived his whole life in the mountains, is struggling to get used to city and school life and works multiple part-time jobs just to get by. At school, Sojuro quickly becomes friends with Tsukiji Tobimaru, the student council vice president, and Kinomi Hosuke, a classmate and co-worker at the same part-time job. The two help Sojuro with adjusting to city life and getting on good terms with Aoko, who is irritated by Sojuro for no reason.
At night, Aoko and Alice move around in the city to defeat enemies sent by an unknown mage who they suspect is trying to take over their territory. Although they have no trouble defeating the enemies sent by the mage, one night, while on his way back from work, Sojuro accidentally witnesses Aoko's battle and runs away before neither Aoko nor Alice could identify him. Those who stumble upon a mage's world must be eliminated, so Aoko and Alice spend the next few days looking for the trespasser. Once they discover Sojiro to be the one, Aoko makes plans to eliminate Sojiro by inviting him to an abandoned amusement park in the next town.
At the amusement park, Aoko attempts to kill Sojiro as she chases him in a house of mirrors. However, they're interrupted by a puppet that looks like Aoko. The puppet, sent by the unknown mage from earlier, attempts to kill Aoko, but is destroyed along with the house of mirrors by Aoko with the help of Sojiro. Just as Aoko decides Sojiro is not such a bad person and agrees to spare him for the time being, Alice appears out of nowhere and announces her intention of not letting Sojiro leave the place alive. Alice unleashes an ancient ploy or familiar called Flat Snark that can bring objects from fantasy to life. Flat Snark turns the entire amusement park into a fairy tale-like land filled with monsters as Aoko and Sojiro attempt to flee the park. At the end of the epic battle, with the help of Sojiro, Aoko destroys Flat Snark with her signature magic missile. Before all is over, Sojiro saves Aoko from one final attack from the then still alive Aoko puppet before it is finally destroyed.
Having lost to Aoko, Alice agrees to let Sojiro live, with the condition that eventually they erase his memory. Much to Alice's dismay, Aoko forces Sojiro to live in the mansion so she can keep an eye on him until the spell for erasing memory is found. In the days that follow, Sojiro struggles to fit in and get used to living with the two mages. As time goes by, Aoko and Alice slowly warm up to Sojiro. In an attempt to further strengthen their friendship, Sojiro gifts Aoko and Alice tickets to an aquarium while he stays home to watch the house. While the two mages are gone, Sojiro receives a visit from the unknown mage that has been attacking Aoko and Alice. The enemy mage turns out to be Toko, Aoko's older sister who is back for revenge and to take back what she feels should have been hers.
Now aware of their enemy's true identity, Aoko and Alice split up to confront Toko. Alice encounters Toko first, and the two battle. Just when it seems Alice has the upper hand, Toko reveals her trump card, a phantasm golden werewolf named Lu Beowulf, who is immune to magic. Alice is severely wounded and left to die as Toko and Lu leaves to fight Aoko. Sojiro, after learning of Alice's predicament from Toko, decides to help and runs out to help the injured Alice, carrying her back to the mansion. Alice asks Sojiro to bring her to the church, where she requests help from Eri, Yuika, and Ritsuka. They find a badly wounded Aoko and bring her to the church as well. As Aoko and Alice recuperate and plan their next and final battle with Toko, Sojiro talks to Aoko and Eri to learn more about Aoko's past as well as himself.
Aoko and Alice, despite their weakened state, go out at night to confront Toko before Toko can officially take over their territory. As the two are about to be defeated by Toko and Lu again, Sojiro shows up and, much to everyone's surprise, defeats Lu by temporarily rupturing his heart. Although Lu immediately recovers, he becomes aware of the concept of death and is unable to continue the fight. Just as Aoko is expressing her amazement at Sojiro's feat, Toko kills Sojiro, prompting Aoko to activate the time-based fifth magic, the skill that she inherited from her family and which Toko is trying to take. Aoko brings Sojiro back to life and easily defeats Toko. Just as Aoko is about to kill Toko, Sojiro stops her, resulting in her to instead place a curse on Toko so that she could never come back to Misaki Town.
Days after the final battle on New Year's Eve, Aoko brings Sojiro to her home, where her grandfather could erase both his and Aoko's memory. It is revealed through their conversation that the mountain village where Sojiro came from may actually be a training ground for assassins cut off from the outside world, which explains why Sojiro was able to stand up to Lu. Upon meeting Sojiro, Aoko's grandfather changes his mind and decides something as troublesome as erasing memory should be done by Aoko herself. As a result, Sojiro continues to live with Aoko and Alice in the mansion. The two mages have long since accepted him to be a member of their home, and despite having already found the memory erasing spell, decide to overlook the spell and let him live in the mansion with them. And they all lived happily ever after.
The end. Until the murder mystery happens, which literally does happen, but we don't need to get into that.
Well, we'll talk about it a little bit later because it is fun. But yes, there is a bonus murder mystery scenario, which is basically what if Danganronpa in the Nasu-verse. And it is very fun. But yeah, that is the main story of Mahoutsukai no Yoru. As you can already tell if you've been watching all of the Type Moon stuff with us, this has obvious connections in terms of characters to Garden of Sinners, to Tsukihime. It has thematic and narrative connections to Fate Stay Night. And on our Top 10 Games of the Year podcast, where we talked about the best games of 2022, and we debated whether this was a game, but had it on our lists. I said this game kind of feels to me like the Rosetta Stone for Nasu's entire project. So, Sean, maybe first you can just give us the brief history of this and where it comes from, and then we can talk about why it has that kind of outsized role in the Nasu-verse.
Yeah, so, as a recap of stuff we talked on some of the early episodes of Season 2 of Japanimation Station, Mahoutsukai no Yoru, in its original conception, was a novel that Kinoko Nasu wrote in 1996 after being inspired by the first episode of Neon Genesis Evangelion to try to get back into writing. And so he wrote this draft of a novel that he submitted to some novel competitions, which were not accepted because it was too long and he couldn't figure out how to get it shorter under the page length. And so it kind of went on a shelf, and there was stuff with Takashi Takeuchi, the illustrator, that came up with some character designs and stuff. But eventually it never really came to fruition. And then eventually, obviously, they went on to make Garden of Sinners. Garden of Sinners includes Toko, right? Aoko's sister is in there. That's where she is officially used in an officially released project. But her character originally came from Mahoutsukai no Yoru. Then eventually they released Tsukihime. In the prologue of Tsukihime, Aozaki Aoko, the main character of Mahoutsukai no Yoru, appears. She's the character that gives Shiki, the main character in Tsukihime, the glasses that allow him to sort of control his mystic eyes that he has. So she appears there. Again, she originally came from this draft novel, but that was the first time she was ever in anything released. And so Mahoutsukai no Yoru is this kind of origin point where some of these characters that are recurring characters that pop up in other places, some of Sojiro's whole stuff was kind of reused in a different way as for Kuzuki Sensei and Fate's Day Night, which we can talk about as well. But so the character stuff came up, but then also Mahoutsukai no Yoru is where the conception of magic and the mystic and that kind of stuff really starts for Nasu in his works, even if it wasn't originally released. Now, obviously, the visual novel we have is not just that original draft, right? So there are things about it that obviously they is building off of the ways that some of those fantasy ideas were developed, but at the same time, the core of the story, and especially I think what is most critical is the notion of the distinction between magecraft and magic, or true magic, however you want to translate those terms. Majutsu in Japanese, magecraft, or maho, true magic, is how it's usually translated, which is kind of the root of some of the notion of magic. All of that stuff comes from the original draft. It's part of the title, Mahoutsukai no Yoru, which on the Holy Night is kind of not really a translation of. Really, it would be Night of the Magician would probably be the most straightforward translation of that title. But yeah, so that all the kind of fantasy world building around magic, it really comes from here. You see echoes of that through all the rest of his projects. And so, yeah, I think calling it a sort of Rosetta Stone or a kind of this origin point is very appropriate for what Mahoutsukai no Yoru is, even in this kind of modified visual novel form that it ultimately exists in.
Because, you also get, and this is stuff that would have been there in the original draft, just the whole character dynamics. The idea of the kind of, Sojiro Suzuki is the first of the Nasu boys, right? He is the first one in that line of, why am I forgetting the name? The main Mikiya
Kokuto?
Kokuto, sorry. I wanted to say Kosuke, and that's wrong. Yeah, Mikiya Kokuto in Garden of Sinners. Obviously, Shirou in Fate's Day Night. I assume there's someone like that in Tsukihime. But basically, your boy who is seemingly on the surface pretty normal and well-adjusted, but there is something else going on, and it is the encounter with the girl that kind of reveals that. The girl who seemingly is more messed up at the beginning, but maybe is less messed up by the end. And that is obviously Aoko Aozaki. Aoko is a fairly clear prototype, I would say, for Rin in Fate's Day Night, like Tosaka Rin. They're ultimately pretty different characters, but on the surface, and I think in that initial confrontation, there's quite a few similarities there. Alice is maybe one of the more unique characters in this compared to some of the other stories we've talked about. But, you have all of those dynamics. You also have, and I think what makes this, why I use the term Rosetta Stone, is also because, this is by far the simplest of the stories we've talked about.
Yes.
This is way more straightforward. There are There's some scenes where they play with chronology a tiny bit, like the day before, but there's none of the out-of-chronology storytelling like Garden of Sinners. There aren't multiple routes like in Fate Stay Night. And even within all of that, the stakes are just much, much lower than any of those. Like, this is about a battle for control of this one area of the world that most of the people in that area would have no idea that that control had even shifted. And the most kind of big thing that is happening is maybe Aoko and Alice are going to die, in this battle with Toko. It is very small stakes. It is very intimate. Most of the game is a three-hander with your three main characters, and in the end, a fourth with Toko. The side characters who come up probably have more dialogue in the extra, like, murder mystery thing at the end than they do through the actual body of the actual visual novel. It is also significantly shorter at just about 25 hours to play through the whole thing. And I think all of that allows you to sort of see some of the basic ideas in a much more stripped down, direct capacity. Not just in that, like, it explains things like magic and true magic in a much more straightforward way than the other Nasu pieces do, but also because it is so low stakes and it is relatively slow paced. I think you just see a lot of those thematic concerns come to the surface. Like, this is set in the late 1980s, and Japan's boom economy is stopping the boom, and we are entering a period of basically Japanese stagflation that would last for a very long time. And so there is this economic downturn going on. And something I've also noticed, that's in all of Nasu's other stuff as well. Like, that is there in the first episode of Garden of Sinners, which I recently rewatched, is that whole apartment complex that the suicides are built around. There's a whole spiel from Toko that is really close to dialogue in this about the amusement park, about a place that was built during the boom that no longer has a place in the world during the bust. And that is an idea he keeps coming back to. And so there's so many pieces like that I think make it that even though this is not an Ufotable work yet, we had to talk about it this season because so many paths that I think you would talk about discussing Nasu's work come back to Mahoutsukai no Yoru.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things is that, like, this is kind of the only thing that Nasu wrote that is specifically about magic, right? Like, it's a part of everything else. It's a part of Garden of Sinners. It's a bigger part of Fate Stay Night, but it's not what those stories are really about. Whereas this, it's like, Mahoutsukai no Yoru is about magic. Like, there's a reason why that's in the title. And it's, and it is, like, Aoko is as much a POV character as Sojiro is, right? Like, in that sense, they are co-protagonists, right? With, like, Alice is obviously the other, like, most important character here. But Sojiro and Aoko, one thing that separates this from other, or like specifically from the visual novels, from Tsukihime or Fate Stay Night, for those, outside of very select specific scenes, they are told totally from the POV of the boy, right? Partially because those are also specifically, like, romantic visual novels where you have different love interests that you pursued in the different routes. But here, Sojiro and Aoko are treated equally as protagonists. So one of our main characters who is a POV character is a witch or a mage. Like, it is her world, and it is a world of magic that you're completely embroiled in. And there's not a Holy Grail war and servants and all that kind of stuff. That's like, that shit in Fate Stay Night is exotic and insane, even within the realm of magic. Here, it's like very much about magic and what that is. And that's one of those things that is kind of a little bit of a light bulb moment about it for me as a longtime Nasu fan, is that some of the stuff that goes in to depth here with magic is stuff that you only know from, like, reading wikis or from, like, the extra lore things on the side in Fate Grand Order or this little bonus scene in Fate Stay Night or stuff like that. Whereas here, it is, like, the focus of the story, and it's what it's about. Magic, both literally and, like, figuratively in this world. And that's one of the things that's incredibly fun about it as a fan of this stuff, is just to dive into magic and what it means and its implications, and the vision and idea of magic that Nasu has is so fascinating and so completely different from any other fantasy work I've ever seen.
Yeah. And of course, the other notable thing about it, while I am not someone who's played a ton of visual novels, and I think you've played more, but would not say that's, like, probably your, like, expert genre, right?
No.
I think both of us would say this is the best produced visual novel we've ever seen. And from circles of people who have, I think, would call themselves more experts in the genre, I have seen the same sentiment. Talking specifically about the 2022 version we have now that is out in English as well and is on PS4 and Switch and has full voice acting and HD and everything. This is just a absolutely spectacular production. It is not video gamey in any way because this is a purely linear novel with no choices or anything like that. But you have just a staggering amount of art. It is all so beautiful. You have a staggering number of character portraits and animations, and every scene in this visual novel is so bespoke and is so lovingly crafted. You can tell what a labor of love this was for everyone at Type Moon. Because in a sense, I mean, when they made this in 2012, it's almost like the victory lap. They've conquered the world of visual novels, and now we're coming back and doing this piece that kind of helped spawn all of it. And I think the music and everything, and in this version now, the voice acting, it is just such a loving and stunning production. And you put all of that together, and this is just one of the most incredible things I've ever seen in any medium.
Yeah, like if people are curious what is different about this remastered version, it is like specifically it is just they remastered the art. So it's the same art fundamentally. It's just they kind of rescanned it in and it's a higher resolution. I actually downloaded, it took a while to get this fucking run, but the Japanese original visual novel version on PC because I was curious if there were any other differences. And it's lower resolution, but the art still obviously looks fucking good. It's just like, it's kind of cleaned up now. But then other than that, the only thing they added was voice acting. The original game had no voice acting at all, which stands out in a weird way because everything else is so high quality that it's kind of weird that there's no voice acting in the original PC release. But they've got a really killer voice cast, which we'll go through for this one. But everything else, like there's no additional story or anything like that. They didn't add any new CGs or illustrations to it. No new music, nothing like that. It is a very straightforward remaster, but much appreciated because for us, in many ways, the biggest thing is that it's just available in English and you can just get it over here. And then also, if you're someone who can read Japanese or is interested in practicing Japanese, a cool bonus is all the Japanese text is in there in the English release as well. You can go into the options and change the language for the text. So if you want to see it in Japanese, you can also look at the Japanese text, which I liked because every once in a while I would switch over to the Japanese version and see how they translated stuff. But it is, in terms of a visual novel production, as you said, Jonathan, I would not ever say claim to be an expert, but I've played a decent number of visual novels and quite a few of the ones that people would consider like big classics. And this is the most impressive I've ever seen a visual novel be in a pure production sense. And I would say that's fundamentally true of the 2012 version as well. Like it's impressive, not just because it's like, Type Moon is like a very successful company and so can afford to like put a lot of time into visual novels and stuff and put more money overall into this project than most visual novels, which are typically fairly indie. It's like the skill is what it is. It is fundamentally, there is a level of like skill and care and craftsmanship that goes into this. Because visual novels are a thing that you can only make so good by throwing money at it. There are only so many people that can work on a visual novel. It's not an Assassin's Creed game where you can have 1,000 people on the development team. Like, it's a very modest development team of people that actually worked on this thing. But it's just that level of craftsmanship, and for me, it's like the density of it. It is a visual novel that is like a kind of a medium length one. It's like 25 hours to 30 hours in length. Which sounds long, but is much shorter than something like Fate Stay Night. So on the website, there's a website, vndb.org, the visual novel database, which is a good website if you're interested in visual novels. It's got lots of like information on visual novels and their releases and translations and stuff like that, and reviews and things like that from users. Like that has Fate Stay Night at 85 hours in length, right? So that like puts you into perspective of how long these visual novels can often become. Mahoutsukai no Yoru at 25 to 30 is like very modest, but it has so much production within that more modest length that gives it this hugely powerful handcrafted quality to it. That means it's more impressive to me in a visual sense and the way scenes are constructed than the Tsukihime remake, which I've played through the first route of by now, which also is amazing and looks gorgeous and is better looking than any other visual novel I've played aside from Mahoutsukai no Yoru. But It's too long to be able to have that handcrafted quality. It's too long for there to be someone who you feel like really sat down and thought about, how am I going to use my character portraits in this scene? How am I going to like move them? How am I going to cut from scenes to scene? How am I going to use combinations of our more elaborate illustrations with our standard backgrounds and character portraits and move them and split the scene and have things scroll across? Like, there's just so much creativity and energy and effort that went into making every single sequence of Mahoutsukai no Yoru feel crafted and not just a standard visual novel scene of a background with some text on it or two characters and like a little box at the bottom of the text thing. And the most you get is like a fade as the character portrait shifts emotions. That's what you usually get for most visual novels for 90% of experience. And for most visual novels, that's great and totally fine. Here, every scene is different. No scene feels like it's just replicating the same visual presentation as the last 5 hours you played of the game. And that's something that is really remarkable about Mahoutsukai no Yoru.
It really, I think, proves the power of this medium of like, why would you want the visual novel version instead of just put all the text in a book and let you read it at your own pace, right? And maybe put some illustrations in there. And I think you see with this, like, there is such an impact to the composition of visuals, the quality of the art, the preciseness of the framing, when they choose to throw an image at you, how they transition from one image to another. There are parts of this where just, a piece of text followed by a certain image will be emotionally devastating or emotionally euphoric. There is an entire section like chapter 5 and 6, which is the big sort of centerpiece at the amusement park, the thing Ufotable is going to go to fucking town on in the movie, that is a true tour de force, like with the visuals that they give you, the experimentation in visual style, all of the shit they throw at you, the hugeness of the ideas that Nasu is putting into the text that then the visuals will be able to sort of hint you at, but not throw you all the way there, because this isn't a full animation. It really is such a masterpiece of the format. I think it makes you excited to want to go play other visual novels just because it has opened up a whole world of expression in the mastery of the format.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like, as someone who really likes visual novels but kind of fell off of them because they're very long and they're hard to fit into your life, like this just was like a huge like injection of everything that makes visual novels good, and it's why like I immediately jumped into importing that Tsukihime remake, because I'm like, I gotta play more of these because this game is so good. It's so much fun. It's so well put together. Yeah, it's fucking, that side of it is incredible. But then also the everything that presentation is delivering to you, which is fundamentally the writing, the prose, the story, like that is also incredible.
Yes, and just hopefully we'll have some time in here just for me to read out some of my favorite passages, because Nasu's prose is absolutely gorgeous. I think this translation is very striking. It has some weird typos and romanization things, but overall I found it to be a very readable and beautiful translation. But Sean, let's talk about what makes this story so special.
Okay, well, what is that for you?
What is that for me? That's a good question. I think ultimately it is the characters. I think it is this trio of characters of Alice, Aoko, and Sojiro. I think it is the bracing emotional places that we go to, and I don't want to act too seriously. There's parts of this novel that are very fun and funny, but I think there is a fundamental vulnerability that you see in the other works as well with Sojiro of, how much abuse this character takes, how good-natured he is about it, and then how much you start to feel for him and for the pieces that are missing from him. And I think you start to see something similar with Aoko, who is a magician. Well, she's a mage, sorry. But she is relatively...
No, she's a magician. She can use fucking magic, motherfucker.
She can, at the end of the game. But yes, for most of the game, she's just a mage. But yes, she is a magician. But she, she is relatively new to this world in so much as she was not expecting to take on the family legacy. And, she is also being presented with things that are hard for her to follow through on, like killing the nice boy, because that's what the Mage Association says you've got to do when people come, right? And I think watching how those characters circle each other and navigate this space, and everything about it just feels so vivid. These characters feel so real. It feels like such a slice of an actual full three-dimensional world that you've been asked to come inhabit. And I think watching how they bounce off each other and fill each other's missing pieces, because like all of Nasu's stories, this is fundamentally a love story. And I think Alice plays in there as well. It's really tremendously beautiful. And of course, it brings up a bunch of fascinating and interesting themes and ideas that I want to hear you talk about, Sean, because on our Top 10 podcast, you hinted at some really interesting interpretations of this game. But I do think just ultimately seeing these characters come into a certain maturity over the course of this and open up to each other, and, you know, the process of letting someone into your life, it really is absolutely beautiful. There's this line near the end of the game, and I'm trying to find it here. I have, as I have done for a lot of our podcasts this year, my new way of taking notes is I just take pictures of everything and then put them in a Google folder because it's easier than trying to write down things, right? But there's this line where they're talking about, it's near the end of the game where they're walking over to the grandfather's mansion, and basically the last chapter of this game is a long walk that Aoko and Sojiro take through the snow. And there's this part where she's asking him, well, how did you and Alice get to be friends? Because by the end of this game, Alice and Sojiro are pretty tight, even though Alice really tries hard to kill him in Chapter 5. And he says, I don't think there's any particular time I can point to when it happened, but if I had to, I'd say it started the first time we spoke, and we got a lot closer after talking that time in the foyer, too. And ... from Aoko, that's it? Because that sounds so simple, right? Well, I'd had to say it started when we spoke, and it continued after that. Then he says, yeah, getting to know someone is all about little moments like that. Wouldn't you agree? And that's Mahoutsukai no Yoru to me. Cut through all of the magic, all of the setting, all of the absolutely crazy shit that happens in this game. And it is a game about getting to know someone in the little moments and then staking your life on it. And I think it is tremendously beautiful and meaningful in that space.
Yeah, and I think for me, there's this, like, the whole other layer of the story, which is there's, like, these really big, very powerful, evocative themes that play out through the characters and through particularly, like, the setting that I found really moving and powerful about, like, magic and nature and human civilization. Like, to me, that is, like, fundamentally, on a thematic level, what the game is about. And it's about, like, this intersection between human civilization, the city, and the people that live there, and, like, Aoko and that, and then the nature and the natural world, which is where Sojiro comes from, right? Sojiro is, like, this very symbolic character because he's very bizarre, right? He's this man young man who grew up in the mountains. You later learn it's like the whole assassin community thing, like Kuzuki Sensei. But fundamentally, symbolically, he's from the natural world and has, like, kind of descended into human civilization, completely ignorant of it. And like how human civilization is reflected in his eyes is so fascinating, and the role that magic plays in that. There are multiple times I think that they make interesting comments about how, for Sojiro, like, the magic that Aoko performs and the magic of a street lamp coming on at night is the same thing. Like, technology is magic and magic is technology. It's a little bit that kind of like Arthur C. Clarke thing of, like, any technology that's sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. It's like, for Sojiro, that is the world that he lives in. But there's that. But then there's also, like, the whole setting of of Misaki Town, this little town that was a small Japanese village that has exploded into this weird little, almost kind of little metropolis that is nestled between these hills and within this massive forested area because of the economic boom. But now that economic boom has passed, and it's just sort of, like, stuck here in this stage of sort of, like, mid-development between what human settlements used to look like and what they now look like. And then you've got the forest with the ancient English manor in there where Alice lives, and all of her fairy tale powers that pull out from, like, the darkness and the shadows of the forest and the corners of human imagination and dreams. And I think all of these evocative elements of dreams and imagination and the magic from that, the magic of civilization and technology, and then, like, the kind of simple magic of the earth and the natural world that has no ego, which is what is very much Sojiro. All that stuff coming together and blending and then coming apart and having, like, grown from this intersection is, to me, very much what the story is about. And I just came away from it really, really moved by the notion of what magic is in this world. And again, in both like literally the magic that happens, but that sort of like the magic of the power of those human relationships, as you're saying, of the slow growth that happens through those conversations and overcoming those differences, and the kind of the simple magic that it happens there. It's it's a beautiful Christmas game as well, because it is about Christmas, right? The Holy Night, of which on the Holy Night is Christmas. It's when I finished the game was on Christmas, and all those things. It's like intentionally set at that time, right? And so that is also part of the mood there, and part of like what is evocative about it as well, is it's all about the magic of Christmas.
Indeed, it's my new favorite Christmas game. Yes. But yeah, and I think because of the structure of the story, it also contextualizes for me some of why Nasu conceptualizes magic the way he does. I think ideas like the magic circuits and the way magic is kind of constructed almost as like a technological force makes sense in this context when it is literally put in contention with the actual technology that is taken for granted by Aoko and Alice, but is brand new to Sojiro. And so, well, what's the difference between the circuit that charges up a light bulb and the magical circuits that Aoko has in her body that power the magic, right? There's things like that where I think the vocabulary used and the way things are conceived, the idea of magecraft, the not true magic, the thing that humans have kind of harnessed and almost industrialized, right? Where like this is almost an apprentice craft that these girls are learning and have mastered or are trying to master, versus the true magic we see in the finale, or hints of it we get with just the sheer enormity of what Alice is able to summon through her fairy tales, right? And like the things that are truly outside of the realm of like human comprehension, which I think is where true magic lies, and Nasu's ability to, gesture at that and conceive of that, versus sort of, there isn't actually a huge difference in some sense between the magecraft and technology in terms of how it has been sort of made normal by the mages in this world. And all of that that's another way it just kind of opens up, okay, this is why some of this is conceived of in this way in later stories as well,
Yeah, and for people who kind of want that explanation of the difference there between Majutsu or Magecraft and Mahou, true magic, depending on which like fan translations you've read, they're like people have translated these terms differently a lot. But fundamentally, Majutsu or Magecraft in Nasu's sort of worldview, that's the kind of normal quote unquote magic you see characters like Rin or Aoko do all the time, like shooting fireballs and stuff from your hand. That kind of magecraft is fundamentally using magical energy to accelerate and or exaggerate an otherwise natural process, or it's something you could do normally through the laws of like physics and science and things like that. You are just achieving it in a kind of like exaggerated fashion through magic. Maybe the most obvious example to use is like Shirou's ability to create swords, right? A sword is a thing that you can make. That's like, you can do it. It's fucking hard. It takes a lot of work, but you can make a sword. So Shirou is able to use magical energy to create the sword. He just has like cut out that middleman process of having to do all the work to make it. That's what magecraft does. Magic, true magic, is using magical energy to achieve an end that is otherwise impossible, that exceeds, what, as you say, human comprehension. So in the instance of Mahoutsukai no Yoru, that is time travel, right? Being able to change or manipulate time is a thing that you cannot do. There is no means to go back to the past. It is fundamentally possible. It cannot be done no matter what, in the normal laws of human existence. And so being able to do that, to travel through time or manipulate time, that is the realm of true magic, that you can only access if you're, from someone who has touched the root or passed that down to their successors, right? And so part of the thing with magecraft then, and this game gets into it, is that the notion of what is possible through normal human processes has changed throughout history and expanded. So the scope of what magecraft can accomplish is greater now than it was 1,000 years ago. But similarly, the realm of like true magic, the realm of fantasy and of like, usually like what they call mystics, or shinpi is the Japanese word, like the realm of the mystical and gods and monsters and stuff like that, that has coincidingly receded over that course of time. So that as science and human civilization and our understanding of the world has developed, our ability to use that kind of magecraft is actually enhanced. But our ability to understand and interact with true magic is a thing we cannot do anymore. And that's one of the things that separates, for instance, in Fate Stay Night, why Medea as a caster is fundamentally different than the modern day mages, is that she is from a time when that is what all magic effectively was true magic, because everything was impossible. Like everything was so far outside of human comprehension or grasp. And so she lived in a very, time of mystics and the mystical. Whereas now, as like Mahoutsukai no Yoru says, mages think that magic is effectively dying and that eventually it will go away because science and human civilization has overtaken that and made like fantasy and dreams and the impossible have gone away because of what civilization has made feasible for humans to actually just accomplish using normal technology.
Yeah. I love it. It's such an interesting presentation of magic. I think I said this on an earlier episode this season. This blows my mind that I myself, I'm not making a straw man here. I myself, at one point in my life, would have said Harry Potter is a very creative use of the idea of magic and storytelling. That's just people grab a wooden stick and say words and send energy beams out. It is so crazy how much Nasu conceives of magic in this systemic but also existential way to really kind of blow your mind back in your seat while you're reading through this stuff.
Yeah, because the other thing here is where Sojiro fits in that whole schema, right? Where you've got the humans and you have the mystic, but the mystic is fundamentally true magic. That's a product of humanity, right? That's the product of human dreams and human imagination. They give power to the impossible and the fantastical. Whereas Sojiro exists outside all of that because that's the realm of humanity. He's from nature. He's fundamentally kind of inhuman. He so exists outside of that whole scheme. And that's part of, I think, what's really fascinating about it is to me, part of the construction here is that true magic is what humans see in the forests, in the mountains, at night, and that's the realm of Alice, that she is this is what people imagine or fear or dream about the forest at night. But Sojiro isn't what people see of it. He is it. He is from it. He is of that world. So it's he exists outside of those dreams and that kind of imagination, or it's or he did for almost his whole life, and now he's starting to get it, right? The moment of his sort of excommunication is this moment of questioning, why am I here on this map? Why am I here? Why are we doing this? He has this one moment of kind of ego that exists for himself and that casts him out of this purely natural world. Literally in the plot, it's because now he can't be used for their assassination shit. But symbolically, it's because it's almost like Adam in the Garden of Eden or something.
Yes.
You now have self-awareness. You can't exist in this world of pure nature. You must go to the world of the humans. But I love the notion that it's not that magic is the realm of nature. Magic doesn't exist in nature any more than it exists in normal technology. It's both of those are outside the scope of magic. It is what humans see in those things is where magic can become possible. It's about human imagination. That's, I think, a really fundamental thing about the construction of these characters in the story here.
Sojiro is, in every sense, he's a prelapsarian character fallen into the real world, right? Prelapsarian meaning, from the Garden of Eden, from before the fall of man, right? And he comes out of that realm into ours, and he is, in and of himself, kind of a magical force because he cannot fully be comprehended by people. It's the turn of every Nasu story, but it is most literal here where it is Sojiro just presents a challenge to everyone who encounters him. They cannot understand this kid because he is relatively egoless. He does not understand modern culture. He does not understand humor. It's the thing that angers Aoko about him isn't anything he does because he never does anything to her. It's the lack of doing. It is the lack of comprehension that she has of him. This is something she cannot get her head around. It's also, I think, the thing that Alice tries to kill him because of the basic, code of magicians, but Alice, I think, always is fairly warm towards Sojiro because I actually think she does get him on some level. There's something about him, that prelapsarian aspect of him that appeals to her. And Sojiro is my favorite of the Nasu protagonists. I think he is such a cool character. Obviously, he's absolutely fucking hilarious, and there are many scenes that are very funny, and there are very silly character portraits of him in the game, and there's all sorts of good gags around him. But also, I just think the emotionality that you get out of this kid and the sense of melancholy you get in certain scenes, like when he has his little room in the attic that Aoko gives him to be a dick, because Aoko is mean to him in this game. But he gets up there and it's the first place where he's felt like home because he can see the moon at night and there's no like temperature control and it feels natural to him and he is closer to the source. He is closer to nature. Moments like that, or just little moments where he will stand up for himself and realize, like, you're being really mean to me right now, Aoko. Like, the ways I think it deconstructs parts of the tsundere archetype and all of that is fascinating. And, of course, near the end, I think when he really has his, like, moment of growth in the church talking to the father, that is one of my favorite scenes in this visual novel or in anything we've watched. And of course, what he does in the events of the game's finale, where he does the most badass fucking thing in the history of fiction. It's up there on par with like Doctor Who in the episode Heaven Sent. It also involves a punch. It's so cool. And, I adore this character. It's such a phenomenal character creation.
Yeah, he's incredible. Like, Kobayashi Yusuke is the voice actor. People would probably best know him as the main character Subaru in the series ReZero. But it's a great performance because it's one of those performances where it's like the character is so mellow and so calm that it's like you got to get a lot of mileage out of a very limited number of emotions. Kind of like Alice as a character is a similar challenge. But he gets so much, I think, emotional depth from that. Even when he has to become crazy killer assassin mode at the end or whatever, the way that he's able to push it just a little bit darker, but it's still Sojiro, right? Like, even like when he's intense and becoming violent, like it's still not, crazy. I've like now I'm using ore instead of boku and I'm just going like very intense. It's not going very far with it. It's just little nuances that push him to the different emotional places. But for me, with Sojiro, like the big thing with this character that I think is fascinating that they do is that he has his bandages around his neck that then eventually gets replaced with a collar because, as you say, Aoko likes to be a fucking dick.
Yes.
And he's got that around his neck for the whole game. Alice sees what's under there once after he wakes up, after all the amusement park stuff happens. But other than that, you never actually see what is under there. Yes. You never see what's on his neck. Now, it implies, and my interpretation is that it's scars from he tried to kill himself. Presumably when he was told to leave the mountain, he tried to kill himself in that field of flowers that the climax of the game is set in, because he tries to strangle himself there, and Alice stops him saying, like, are you going to leave us again once he's come back to life? And that scene is pulled from his memories, and he is in some way pulled back to that moment. But there's something about the willingness to sort of to keep that a secret or whatever, and to just leave it as implication, and you never show it. But it is like kind of in some ways everything about his character that is like the one thing you never see about him is like he's a completely open fucking book 100% of the time, except for this one thing. And that's, again, it's one of the things that gives him this angelic or almost Adam in the Garden of Eve kind of quality, that it's like it's the one scar, it's the one imperfection he has, because he has other scars, right? He has other scars that he's fine with people seeing that he got from training on the mountains. But this one moment of him, again, presumably trying to kill himself and there being some scars left behind by that attempt, is the one thing he doesn't show anybody. It's like the one piece of shame he has. Like, there's something so emotionally powerful about that. And again, the game's like willingness to let that just quietly be there and not dig into it, I think is, I was kind of shocked by the choice to do that and how powerful that is by the end of the story.
The pathos of it is overwhelming, and I agree. And it's one of the things that, like, this almost has to be a visual novel because it's just there in the character portrait throughout. you know? I'm curious what kind of role it played when this was just a book Nasu had written, because it would have to be something that you would have to put in the text and remind us of, right? And when it's a visual novel, it's just this little thing ticking in the background that you're always seeing on him, that is there on his body, but is kept so close to the vest that it is never explicitly revealed to the audience. There is the implication, as you say, and it is very sad because it is such a tremendously sad idea to imagine this person, of course, to imagine any person snuffing out their own life, but this boy we've come to know and who has such a vitality for the world, actually, you know, even if he is relatively egoless. You know, it's beautiful. And I think the way that bounces off of Aoko, who is such a wonderful pair to him because she is so phenomenally different and obviously a clear prototype for later characters in the Nasu-verse, but also just, again, one of my favorite protagonists. And, you know, honestly kind of embodies the sort of tsundere thing more even than Rin Tosaka, who is the person, if you Google tsundere, her picture comes up. Aoko is very much that figure, but of course, because we are in her head and because of the twists and turns of this story, it gets picked apart in such fascinating ways. You know, in this case, you mentioned Yusuke Kobayashi's performance as Sojiro, and again, wonderful. And then you have as Aoko, you have Haruka Tomatsu, who is again just to me an immediately iconic performance. Like that is I cannot wait to hear her voice her in the movies and any other projects they have coming up with Aoko, because she is tremendous.
Yeah, and you know, it is a recast because while the original Tsukihime was not voice acted, some of the spin-offs have been. And Aoko is also a recurring character in those spin-offs like Melty Blood. But obviously, like, it makes sense to try to recast the character, particularly for this. Although she does, it was weirdly emotional when I started playing the Tsukihime remake. And that's where Aoko shows up in the prologue of that game. She brings to Shiki, who is the main character of Tsukihime, he's got the mystic eyes of depth perception, like the Shiki of Garden of Sinners. And Aoko brings him glasses that allow him, it's the same kind of glasses that Toko has that allows him to block the mystic eyes of death perception, so he doesn't go insane by seeing death and everything in the world, and he's like an 8-year-old boy. And it's like a really great scene that's very powerful, and it's the first thing that Haruka Tomatsu played as Aoko, because that remake came out a year before this game. And I find that fascinating. I'm curious at what point that those casting choices were made, like if they knew that this was in the pipeline and they're like, well, we want to cast someone who's going to be able to play the young Aoko super well because she's supposed to be like 30 something in Tsukihime. But regardless of how it came about, it's great casting. Haruka Tomatsu, people best know as Asuna, the main female character from the Sword Art Online franchise. She's also, for us, Haru in Persona 5 would be a big touchstone for us.
Which blows my fucking mind, because it's such a different performance than Aoko. Like diametrically different. But yes, one of my favorites in Persona 5. Yeah,
and Aoko's just like the most classic fucking Nasu character. And because she really, in the tsundere archetype, she definitely leans on the Tsun side, which is like the pointy or thorny side. Like she's an unpleasant person. Like if you knew her in your life, you'd fucking hate her goddamn guts, because she's like deeply unpleasant. You understand why she's unpleasant, and like you see like where she comes from because you're in her head. But I do think that like the game doesn't like excuse that behavior. And I think that's one of the things I love about it, is that it recognizes it's like she is like needlessly and intentionally cruel to a lot of the people in her lives, because she's sort of like projecting all of this stuff outwards.
She's a kid. She's a dumb kid. And you like, I think also playing this with, and it obviously being written with the like, it's a nostalgic piece. I think it's looking back at adolescence, and there's the thorniness and a brusqueness to her that I think a lot of people will probably recall from their own adolescence. There's something just, she needs to grow up. And she does grow up over the course of the game. She becomes a markedly better person over the course of this game.
Yeah, through her interactions with Sojiro, because, it's the classic thing of her and Sojiro are opposites, and they learn from what the other person has. Sojiro lacks too much ego. Aoko has too much ego. And so they learn how to sort of like meet more in the middle. And, it's a classic plot construction, but it works incredibly well here. Because the characters are so well drawn and they fit into the overall themes of the story so perfectly. But then also on that note, Jonathan, of this specifically feeling more like it's an intentionally nostalgic piece, like it very much is. Because the thing that's really notable about Mahoutsukai no Yoru is it is the only Nasu thing I can think of that is not set in the year that it comes out. Like, not only just as the visual novel, but even the original draft novel was written in 1996. And as far as I know, that was also originally set in 1989. So it is like very specific, like so much so that the Tsukihime remake updated the setting to be in 2021, including like all the changes that would come with the story of now people have cell phones and the internet's much more ubiquitous and all that kind of stuff is now integrated into that story. Because for most Type Moon stories, I think very intentionally want it to be set exactly in the present moment, down to often the month when it comes out. Like there's a reason why this came out in December and Christmas. That was the same thing with the original release. This was a 10-year anniversary release. Fate's Day Night is set in the exact month that it was originally released in. And they changed the text of the game to update that when the game originally got delayed for a year. And so it is very intentional that this is set in 1989. It is specifically nostalgic. And Aoko is a character that you would understand many of the members of the audience will know her much better in the way she looks at the end of this game with like the shocking red hair and like taller and more adult and confident. And this is like, how did she become that person is a certain way you can look at the story. Like not for us because we didn't really encounter it exactly that way. A little bit for me, but more through like reading wikis and not through actually playing Tsukihime. But now that I've played Tsukihime and seen that version of her, this is very much a story of like, how does this person who's able to guide the main character of that game at this young age and give him this advice that changes his whole life, how does she become this like incredible like wizard or magician, like someone who can wield magic not just by casting spells, but with like her words and her actions and how she carries herself. And you see the seeds of all that at the end of this game of how she becomes that person.
Yeah. And the Tsukihime remake, correct me if I'm wrong, updating the timeline also means that it can more clearly serve as a like piece of this universe, because otherwise the timeline would not make sense in the 1999 version, because that would be like 10 years ago for the main character. She wouldn't be old enough, all of that, right?
Yes, yeah. That's part of it as well. But obviously, in the original Tsukihime, Aoko is a character that nobody knew about.
Yes, exactly. They didn't have to worry about it, but now it made sense to kind of rejigger all of that so it can all serve. Garden of Sinners lines up really interestingly, and I'm excited to talk about Toko, but we should probably talk about some of these other characters first, because she comes in at the end. Because you also have Alice, does Alice show up anywhere else in the Nasu-verse so far?
No, the most is there's a character in part 2 of Fate Grand Order, which I did not know any of this stuff when I played that part of that game. That is broadly connected to Alice through the like witchcraft, the Meisters, like that stuff comes up there in Fate Grand Order. Alice is a character that this is the only thing she appears in, which is a shame because she's fucking great.
She's fucking great. She's ludicrously powerful, terrifyingly powerful. She's like, when we meet her, obviously I think you could argue Aoko overtakes her at the end of the story, but like up until that point, I mean, she is one of the most immediately like overwhelmingly powerful characters we've met in the Nasu-verse, voiced by Kana Hanazawa. Just a great performance. Again, kind of like Sojiro, having to do a lot with a very narrow range of emotion. But yeah, what a cool character. And her magic powers are the coolest fucking thing, because one of the things about the structure of this game is that it's got a very slow opening before you get to the big fireworks of chapter 5 and 6 at the amusement park. And up until that point, magic is mentioned. You're in the POV of Aoko. It exists, but it's abstract. It's very just daily life, slice of life stuff for a little while. But there is this optional text, but don't treat any of the text in this game as optional. Read it all as it comes up. And there's this little piece called 7 Days of Spinning. And in there is an episode where you see from the perspective of one of the things Alice is killing, Alice's attack on it from the perspective. And you are introduced to the nursery rhymes and diddle diddle and all of that stuff. And like that little hint of like, here's what's coming, motherfuckers, is so terrifying. And then you get the full version of it in chapters 5 and 6 with her, Humpty Dumpty spell and flat snark and all of that stuff. And it is the coolest use of magic in all of the Nasu-verse, I think, that I've seen at least. It is so fucking crazy.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, one, I just got to give a massive shout out to Hanazawa Kana for the performance, because she's one of my favorite voice actresses. And this is such a, like, the like golden period of Hanazawa Kana, like that like early 2010s where she was in fucking everything. This feels like a character pulled right from that period of her career. Not to say she's like done great work ever since then as well, but this specifically reminds me of that period of her. And it's my favorite vocal performance in this game. I think it's incredible. The amount of emotion she's able to get out and the comedy, like particularly in the Wonderful World of Ploys, like the weird sort of optional comedy segments that
yes, she's so amazing in those.
Yeah, where she's opposite Robin. Like the amount of comedy she gets out of that is fucking incredible. It's such a great performance. But yes, I think the thing with Alice that's fascinating is she throws this like crazy wrench into the whole construction of magic in this world, because what she's doing, and the game like comments on this multiple times, is basically on the verge of true magic. It's maybe not exactly true magic, but it's like right about there. It's like pushing the boundaries of what really like should be allowed by these rules. And and the other mages like Aoko and Toko comment on it, that it's like she's kind of a freak, right? She is a witch specifically. This is one of the reasons why I don't like the English title, even though I know that the English title originally was made by Nasu for the original release. Like it's in the original logo. It's the Attack on Titan thing. It just got grandfathered in. Our Garden of Sinners, it's the same kind of thing. But here, there's a difference between Aoko and Alice. In the title, Witch on the Holy Night, yes, Aoko is the witch of that title. But she's not a witch. Alice is a witch. Like what she is doing is fucked up and weird and crazy, even to the people in the world of magic. They're like, what what are these ploys? Like, are those familiars? Do those count? Like, how does this work? And they're supposed to be kind of like, they're remnants of, a more mystical time, right? And they're these like fragments of fairy tales and nursery rhymes that human imagination has given shape and power to, that then is being used as a familiar by Alice's family for generations. But it's like pushing the boundaries of what magic can do. And I think it's like a cool, interesting, like weird turn to give it. That it's like you have, this very ordered idea of magic and the rules that Aoko gives you and that her shit follows. But then you've got Alice is just out here doing crazy shit. That like is outside the boundaries of what the rules consider normal. And I do think that that's like important to kind of like mix things up and make it sort of to keep the mystery there or something, like it to keep that kind of mystical quality there, especially because I think it like pairs with Sojiro's whole mountain boy thing really well.
Yes, it's such a fascinating character triad because Aoko is the most normal of the three, even though she's an asshole. She is like she also fits the student council president archetype. Mm-hmm. Like if you've seen like Kaguya-sama Love is War, she has a lot of similarities with that character. Who I know Kaguya isn't the student council president, but you know what I mean. Someone who's like the type A like leader of the student body. She's got all of that. But she's the normal girl. Like we all went to school with people like Aoko, whether you went to Japan or America. Like I remember people who remind me of Aoko, right? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Sojiro and Alice are the fucking weirdos, because Alice is a witch who lives up on a mountain in a fucking mansion, and to her, like, that is normal. And she does scary magic stuff, and it is very scary. Like, that scene in the 7 Days of Spinning optional text, the fucking, like, it is like body horror at a certain point where you've got, like, the things being torn apart, and, like, Alice is a little sadistic in how she does it. All of that is amazing. But then there's this opposite beauty to her. And one of my absolute favorite, like top 5 moments in this visual novel is this scene, the series of scenes really, where Sojiro comes home and he's been given this task by Aoko of like, just try to get along with Alice a little more because this could go south really fast if Alice, because there's this whole period where they're like poisoning Sojiro to keep him on a leash basically and all this stuff. They're very mean. And he comes in and he sees Alice sleeping on the floor with her book and she's leaning up against a banister. And there's a bespoke animation for it and everything. There's a big character portrait for this image because we come back to it a couple of times. The line when he finds her, this is some of my favorite writing in the whole thing, is, "There she slept in the shadows of home, hidden away from outsiders. Her sleeping figure was enough to mesmerize anyone who laid eyes upon her." And later on, it says, her slumber seemed breathless. She was too still, with not even a hint of movement. And yet, slumped against that frigid column under the cold winter sky, happiness appeared to be her blanket. A passerby would not be blamed for thinking she was in that most peaceful state of eternal slumber, death. And I love the whole connection between, like, Alice and Sojiro in some ways are coded very similarly in that their stoicness kind of takes them closer to the root, you could say, right?
Yes.
And there is a, like, awkward, dark, interesting, seductive beauty to that, like, ability to sort of be still and unknowable. And even though Alice does not come out and say it, in this sequence where what ends up happening is Sojiro makes tea to the best of his ability. Alice is a tea snob, and he's doing what he can. But he makes tea, he brings it out, he gets one of his books out, and he just studies. Sits next to Alice, has the tea out. If she wakes up, he'll give her some. She doesn't wake up, and eventually he leaves, and then he comes back the next day and does it again. Alice becomes aware of this, and it's very clearly a turning point where, like, she doesn't say it, but he gets her, and that means she gets him. And from that point on, like, honestly, Alice and Sojiro are pretty tight. It leads to another one of my favorite scenes in the book when he rescues her, and there's another, animation of this, of him carrying her on his back up the mountain, and there's a solidness there, a friendship, a love that is really beautiful and mostly communicated between the lines, but I absolutely love it.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And Alice is the character to me that, like, was kind of a revelation of this game, just because she's the character that I didn't really know anything about. Like, I knew about Sojiro from Osmosis. I particularly knew a lot about Aoko from Osmosis and other Type Moon stuff and reading about it online. But Alice was a character that, like, I kind of knew the name. Like, I was aware that a character like this existed in the game. But actually playing it was like, why is Alice not in everything? Like, how is she not a character in Fate Grand Order? Like, how have they not just sort of... and part of it is, like, maybe now with, like, the movie they're making and they've got Hanazawa Kana playing the character, maybe how have we been sleeping on this character? She's so good, because they should fucking exploit the shit out of this character because she is that good. And they just need to put her in a lot of other stuff because I want to see more Alice.
Well, I know Type Moon said way back in, like, 2012 that they were planning sequels to this game at some point, and those have never materialized. I'm very curious if that's something that is still in the works. It would be fascinating to me to see what would be the next chapter in this story, especially because so many pieces of it have branched off into other pieces of the Nasu-verse.
Yeah, but Alice is the one character that's just like, you gotta, come on, get her out of here. Like, I gotta get more Alice, please.
One character we definitely got more of elsewhere is Toko.
Yes.
And how fun was it to see younger Toko in her mode, in her trash phase as a villain before she mellows out for Garden of Sinners. In many ways, she's a very different character here, and in many ways, she is very recognizable. And as a complement, as a prequel to the character we see in Kara no Kyokai, that alone makes this fucking essential reading if you have seen Kara no Kyokai.
Yeah, it is the thing that, in many ways, I've always been most excited about of the idea of actually reading Witch on the Holy Night, is because I love Toko from Kara no Kyokai so much, and I knew that she's the villain of this game. And it's just like, that's fucking great. Like, that's such a cool idea. And it's, like, amazing to me how well it does connect. One thing that is different, although I think that who they got was very good, they did recast the role, which makes sense. It's been a long time. Takako Honda is who played her in the original movies. She's also not usually in a lot of anime stuff. She, as we talked about in those podcasts, she does a lot more like live action dubbing and stuff like that. I suspect that might be also one of the reasons why the character was recast. But Ruriko Aoki, who plays her here, does a very good job of evoking a similar performance without doing like an imitation or anything like that. Like it's its own performance, but still feels like the same character. And I was a little bit worried when I heard that it was recast, but then I don't think it doesn't negatively affect it at all. It works really well. And the character just, I think, syncs up completely with the character from Kara no Kyokai. Understanding that the character from Kara no Kyokai is, 7-something years later, 7, 8, 9 years later. So she's grown up, and she's sort of learned from the experiences she has, and being kind of humbled at the end of this and giving up on this idea of inheriting the Aozaki magic and inheriting that true magic, and that's something she has moved past by the time of Garden of Sinners. And when you kind of connect the dots in that whole character arc, it's really good and it's really cool, and it hooks up with other stuff that we're not going to cover here, that she appears in other like kind of side stories and things and other Type Moon stuff, because Toko's a character that pops up kind of everywhere. And it was very satisfying to see this origin kind of story for that character, where she originally comes from, and that she can be a fucking utterly terrifying villain, but you still like her. Like, you still like kind of want to see her succeed in some way, like her to learn and grow and like kind of become a more happy person and to move past this is something you're very satisfied to see. Like, you're very relieved when Sojiro prevents Aoko from killing Toko, both because you know that Aoko shouldn't kill her own sister, that would tear her apart, but that also Toko should be allowed to live, that like she can do good things in this world if she's able to grow past this point.
Yeah, because the Toko we meet in Kara no Kyokai is someone who has kind of is living a nomadic life, right? She has given up on the idea of major ambitions. We talked about that a lot in those episodes, that she's someone who is very much the opposite of the main villain of that piece, and that she does not, she thinks it's a bad idea to go after the root. That is not something she wants to do. She does not want to use her powers for these grand ambitions. What she's doing is honestly pretty modest, in terms of like the stakes we've seen in this universe. It's this small series of investigations. It's heavily implied she moves on from this area after the end of, the 7th film, all of that stuff. And I think going back, rewinding the clock to seeing a period when she did have major ambitions, which is hinted at in Kara no Kyokai, that she was not always this way, right? And I think seeing her doing something as devious as the bad guys in Garden of Sinners in many ways, she's trying to kill her own sister. Like, it's evil shit she's up to in this game. But she still has all of the charisma, all of the intellect. The writing on her is very similar. I agree with you completely about the performance. It's because I rewatched recently the first couple episodes of Kara no Kyokai, and I noticed, okay, this is a different voice, but I like hearing the two versions of the character, kind of younger and older, and how they sync up, and they both reflect different pieces of the character. What comes through, of course, is that confidence, is that playfulness, is that little spark in her eyes, like, she could fucking destroy you at any time if she wanted to.
Yeah.
In Kara no Kyokai, mostly she doesn't want to. Here, she very much does, and that makes her a very intimidating villain. But I do just love seeing how all of the pieces come together, and there's so much fun prequelizing for her of how she gets to the place that she is in the future. She is still a puppet master in this one. All the little puppets that they fight, that's her inventions. That's what she's good at. They imply, she has the familiar in Lou Beowulf here. Eventually, she doesn't have him anymore, and that's how she gets, a new apprentice and familiar in Kara no Kyokai. All of those things are just fun to kind of connect the dots with. But also just, I think, on a character level, seeing her be humbled from this ambition and start the process of letting go is great. I also love the detail that this is given to us in the extra, the Danganronpa-esque mystery at the end of the game that you unlock, which is that, she figured out how to come back, because she's cursed by Aoko at the end of this game to not set foot in Misaki City.
Oh, yes.
And she gets past that very easily because she just builds a double. And it's very strongly implying that the second body that she has in Kara no Kyokai that comes up in episode 5 in Paradox Spiral, she built to be able to, lift that restriction. And she does come back to Misaki City. And that's kind of the origin point of her making the perfect puppet and all of that. That's such a cool detail that I love.
Yeah, that blew my mind, that when they threw that in, I was like, oh my god, that's where she mastered her full puppet arts. And it's like, is that also when she bought the second identical red sports car for her puppet party too? Like, when did that happen? I want the origin story of that car, the two cars that she bought. That was awesome. Also, just think the scene where she's fully introduced, there's a scene where she's kind of teased, which is also very fun, where she's at the parlor or whatever, and she's just gambling the slot machine, or the pachinko parlor, I think it is, and she's just like making infinite money basically, and so just sees her in bolts. Like, that's a very good scene. But then later she comes to the manor and comes in and has that conversation with Sojiro, and that's where she's fully introduced, and that's where they they just walk such a good line between her being scary and intimidating and villainous, while also you can see that there's still good in her, right? Like,
Yes.
she could have easily killed Sojiro, and she has every reason in the world to, based on what her goals are, to just kill this kid right here. But she doesn't. And, as she says later, it's like, probably she should have, because she underestimated him, and eventually that's what kind of throws everything for a loop for her plans. But, like, that goodness is also then what gets her life spared, ultimately. And so it's just a good line that they walk, where you can see this more caring person that we know from Kata no Kyokai hidden there beneath all the ambition and villainy.
Another additional chapter you unlock after the main scenario is the Honey Adventure, or however they translate it.
Yes.
Which is basically through Beowulf's eyes, you see the month of December of Toko behind the scenes scheming. And I think you see a much sadder version of the character of this person who is kind of doing this because she has no, almost on autopilot. Like, this is like, I don't know if she actually wants this, or she wants it because her ego has been bruised or something, And, like, it's really interesting to see, you have a couple of major scenes there. The biggest one is her with Father Eri, and that whole scenario where you see that they were in love at one point. That has kind of fallen away for her, but also I think just she is so kind of cold to human connection at this point, and is something that needs to be reawakened in her. You also have the absolutely hilarious detail that she is going to the pachinko parlor every day and winning all this money to buy food for Beowulf and other supplies, and that is how she is funding this whole operation. Is she just comes to Misaki City fucking broke and then goes and cleans up at the pachinko parlor, which is the most Toko Aozaki detail I think you could possibly come up with.
Yeah, it's amazing. And yeah, like that chapter is incredible, because you get, as you say, this like real sense of who she is underneath all of this, and how lost she is, because, if you think about what happened, like, she had this whole plan for her life that was totally reasonable based on the way that mage families work, that she was going to inherit this and all this kind of stuff, and be the successor of the Aozaki line, and that was taken from her, and she lost her whole family, right? Like, how could you be with your family after that has happened? Like, she has no choice but to leave. And so her whole connection to that town that was like what she was meant to inherit, and all her relationships there, her relationship to her sister, her grandfather, her parents, all that is gone. And she goes into the clock tower and studies there and meets some assholes there that, eventually she will help kill, like 10 years down the line. And then she just goes and travels the world, and it makes sense that the only thing she can think to do is like plot this weird elaborate revenge, because it's like she's got nothing. Because their weird disembodied inhuman grandfather spirit dude who's touched the root and all that kind of stuff has decided this for reasons nobody understands. Right? Like, it makes sense that this is who she's become, and it is really sad to see the way that she sort of like loosely is kind of rediscovering some of those connections from like the supporting cast at the church and stuff in that chapter. It's really well done.
It's beautiful. Here's just an excerpt from that chapter I want to read really quick. This is one screen. This is Beo's observation of her. Toko's personality changed significantly depending on whether or not she was wearing her glasses. Beo wasn't sure which side was her true self, but he did know that she was much more serious and cruel without her glasses. It wasn't quite to the level of a split personality, more like a reordering of priorities. She mainly took off her glasses when she was about to fight someone. Doing so made her less human. It pushed all sense of compromise, concern, and sympathy out of her brain. I love that moment, because this is a character also whose visual presence is so striking. The costume they've got her in for this with like the big green overcoat and all of that is so striking. And then of course you think too, her glasses are such a warm part of her in Kara no Kyokai. It's something that like kind of makes you feel safe around her. And all of it is so interesting. Yeah,
you also have the great detail of the hair, right? And that the hair contains some of like your magic or whatever, and so with the female mages grow out their hair, and she has cut her hair so she has this like short haircut, which I always knew that this era of the character had this character design, but I did not know there was a plot reason behind it, and I thought that was also really cool.
Yes. And of course, she's got an ace up her sleeve because she has Lou Beowulf, who, coming back to the themes you were talking about earlier, Sean, with like, nature versus civilization versus technology. She's literally summoned like this. He's not the actual Beowulf. He's not an actual werewolf. He is like a 3,000-year-old incarnation of like the spirit of nature itself. He is one of the most...
He's an earth spirit, yeah.
Yes. He is one of the most powerful beings we have encountered in the Nasu-verse, and the only thing that can beat him is like the idea of mortality itself, which is what Sojiro winds up inflicting upon him in an amazing fucking scene.
Yeah. Beowulf is an awesome character. This is a character I've known about for a long time because he's referenced in other things. And it was very fun to see him. And they particularly get a lot of good mileage out of him in some of those optional events like the honey adventure and stuff at the end. But yes, as I say, he does represent like the magic that does exist in nature. Like he is a naturally occurring mystical entity, the one of which that like very few still exist in this world, to the extent where human-based magic can do nothing against him, because he exists outside the realms of human magic. And so, for those early parts of his like sort of entry into the story is really upsetting and frightening. Like when he's fighting Alice and Aoko, like they get completely destroyed by him. And it's really graphic.
The details of what happens to Aoko, you never see it, but what is written and like implied, and there's this whole scene where Sojiro goes to see her at the church where she is being worked on, and there's the talk about like what it, like her body, like the implication is that her body is just completely torn apart. And like sewing her back together, like there's blood everywhere. It's one of the most like graphic things I've ever seen described, and it is so horrifying. And of course, attests to like the whole idea of magic and how it kind of keeps the body together is very mind-bending. But yeah, he is terrifying in this deep primal way. And of course, what makes Sojiro the thing that Toko could never count on is that Sojiro is from the same world, basically.
Yeah.
And so he is the only one who would ever even have the thought, I could just punch this thing. And he does a little more than that. He times it in such a way that he does this like assassin punch to like stop the heart, and he does that, and he successfully like explodes Beowulf's heart. But by God, what a fucking moment that is!
Yeah, and he completely rips his own arm and elbow apart by doing it. Yeah, and it's like he punches the heart, and then there's I think my favorite shot because it's basically a shot. It's so well done. It basically is just animated. Is him then shifting around to behind Beowulf and elbowing him in the back at the same point where the heart is to do the crazy assassin strike or whatever.
Yes.
But yeah, like that's an incredible sequence. And that's probably like the most impressive sequence to me, just in terms of the construction of it as a visual novel, where it's like, it's pushing the boundaries of like, is this just an animation at this point? It's just like with a very small number of frames, because it's really good. Yeah, that whole sequence is awesome. And this is also where it's like worth mentioning. I did find it very interesting that that Sojiro is connected, or like implicitly connected to the Kuzuki Sensei stuff from Fate Stay Night, Unlimited Blade Works, right? That they both seemingly came from the same assassin camp in the mountains, which has never been like specifically expanded upon. It's mysterious in Fate Stay Night as well. Even if you read the visual novel, like exactly what all that stuff was. It's described in much the same way that Sojiro describes it at the end of Mahoutsukai no Yoru, and also the detail of Sojiro's name, Sojiro, Kuzuki's, and it's Shizuki Sojiro, and then it's Kuzuki Soichiro, with Ichi meaning 1, Ju meaning 10. So it's like, presumably they all have some sort of similar name with numbers 1 through 10 and maybe more, in that assassin camp. Like that was something I had not caught on to at all, until I got to the end of the game. It was like, oh, he does have like an almost identical name to Soichiro from Fate Stay Night. That is crazy. That is, and of course the real world history of that is that Sojiro's character idea for Mahoutsukai no Yoru was reused for Soichiro Kuzuki in Fate Stay Night. And so that's like how that originally came about, but I like that they've kind of rewrapped it up here.
Yeah, it's super interesting. The whole scene in the final chapter when they're on that moonlit walk in the snow, and he talks about this, it's so tender, it's so painful, because, whatever, like, the lore explanation, to me it very much reads as, like, a background of abuse, almost. Like, it's a really painful, like, but it's abuse in that childlike sense of, like, it's all he knew, and so he was connected to it, but he also knew on some level it was wrong, like what they were asking him to do and training him to be. And I think then the suicide idea that is implied there as well. And I think Aoko is very much aligned with the reader at that point of realizing, oh my God, this kid is actually much more complex than I thought. Like, this is the simplicity of him today comes from a ringer of emotional, like, abuse and complexity that I could not have imagined or fathomed. You know, she is what's the word? I'm sorry, privileged in a way that, like, I think she could not have imagined in relation to Sojiro until that scene. And it is so powerful to come through. And I think the way, you know, it takes until the very end for him to open up about this and talk about it at all. And again, it's still in very vague terms, and it's still something he is coming to terms with. And I think all of that is just, again, tender is like the word I keep coming back to, because I think it is so thoughtful and empathetic and beautiful.
Yeah, I think it has so much weight and meaning because they've done such a good job of making Sojiro feel like a character who, as long as you think to ask him the question, he will tell you anything. And I think he kind of thinks of himself that way. But in reality, there is these couple little spots where he doesn't want to do it, and he doesn't want to tell it, and he is hiding them in his own little way. And obviously the scar on the neck or whatever it is the most obvious one, but it's there as well with the exact nature of this community that he grew up in. He's kind of given these sort of half explanations as people have asked him questions about it throughout the whole game. And it's not until the very end, as you say, that he can kind of like actually face up to it and actually open up about it and recognize it for what it is, which it is like what he was put through is inhuman. He was raised to be something that is not human, and that's wrong because he is a human. Like, he should have these connections. He should be connected to the rest of human society. And it is like, it is abuse what was done to him.
And Aoko and Alice have been too, and I think they learned that from him, because that's what the whole fucking Mage Association is. That's what this whole world of magic is too. They are asking these people to be inhuman. Like, what Aoko goes to that amusement park to do to Sojiro, like, she's an asshole, but she's not a murderer, right? Mm-hmm. And that is the line that she finds herself trying to cross. And she is being asked to kill this pure, innocent, nice boy who has never done a single goddamn thing to her. And that is part of why she is so angry at him, is because she cannot find a reason to justify the awful thing she's been tasked to do here. And of course, by the end of the game, they've subtly broken with the mage's code at a certain point, right? Like, they are living their own lives away from it. And, you know, one of the touches I love is there's this little epilogue that plays after the credits that is a couple months later, and it's from Aoko's point of view, where she finds this book in the library with the memory erasing spell. And she's like, oh, we finally found it. And then she realizes Alice was reading this book months ago. Yeah. Alice knew the entire fucking time and didn't do it. And I love that little detail that, like, I think Alice and Aoko both, without ever saying it, came into a conception of their own human morality separate from this magical world they were raised in. And all three of these people are more human and more moral and more good by the confrontation with each other than they were at the start of the piece.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an incredibly touching ending. Yeah, especially because Alice, compared to Aoko, like, she feels like she's the real deal, right? She's the one who's like, Aoko's been kind of like, you know, shanghaied into this world a couple of years ago. Alice has grown up, this is her whole life. And so you 100% believe, were she in Aoko's position, Sojiro would have been fucking dead immediately. Like, it would have been absolutely over. That dude would have been eaten by, like, a weird fucking fairy tale crocodile or some shit. Like, it would be over. Aoko, like, Alice has almost certainly murdered other people. Like, arguably that might have been a person. It's not clear if it was, like, a person or a familiar or what she killed in the, like, that one side story you talked about earlier. But Aoko hasn't crossed that line, and she's, you know, you can kind of feel that she's still on the boundaries of this world. But so to learn that Alice has for months been, like, keeping this a secret, and she hid the book, right? She, like, put it up, like, on this really high shelf where nobody would see it, and Aoko finds it and then puts it back. Like, the fact that she was hiding that for him is a really powerful and touching ending for sure.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. Another couple of just like favorite scenes I want to talk about while we're here. I think we hit most of the big ones. There's one you unlock. It's technically, again, if you have not played this yet, every time something unlocks in the archive, go read it in order. It so enriches it. And there's one around halfway through that is a chapter called Martha. That might be my favorite single chapter in the whole game. Or not chapter, it's a sub piece of a chapter that's optional. But it basically consists of two parts. One is a story that Kumari, also called Kuma in the game, tells about the last of this kind of pigeon in North America that was hunted to the point where there was only one known left in existence, named Martha, and it died. And it's about the like death of the final, breed of something. And it is also where we get our first real encounter with Robin, the blue robin, who, in a fun little trick for that first half of the game, it will chirp, and if you go into the text log and hit the dialogue, it'll have a fully voiced line in Japanese that you can hear. But in that chapter, you start hearing it actually talking and actually speaking, and it gets translated for you. And so it is both the funniest chapter in the game and one of the most just incredibly touching, some of Nasu's most poetic prose. That is like a absolute standout for me. That is like a little literary masterwork on its own fucking like scale.
Yeah, it's basically its own little, like, pocket short story. Yeah, and it's one of the best pieces of writing in the whole game for sure. And I think one thing that's fascinating about it is, like, Sojiro's reaction, right? Where I think you would normally expect that his reaction to hearing this whole story about the extinction of this pigeon species would be that, like, that he would be the one most offended by it. That he would be the one most affected by it because he's the one from nature. Right? It's like he's like the pigeons, right? He's from this world that is being extinguished by human civilization. But that's not the reaction he has at all. Like, he's kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Like, it's like, huh. And that's it. Like, because being from nature, he doesn't have the framework with which to condemn the action of causing an extinction of an entire species. Like, that's a human reaction. That's a human perspective to have, is to say that this is wrong or this is horrifying. Whereas, like, Sojiro is like, well, I guess that's what happened. And that's his whole reaction to it. And I think that's like, it's like really fascinating. And it puts him into perspective of how much he is from that world, that to him, the notion of the species going extinction has no real moral or ethical association with it. And that it's not the reaction that Kuma was expecting either. I think that's like one of the things that makes it as effective as it is it surprises you with what it reveals about Sojiro's perspective and how he sees himself and sees the world around him.
Yeah. And of course, then you also get the fucking... Is that like a Kansai accent the Robin has? It's like a comedy accent.
Yeah, I don't think it's really a Kansai accent. It's just like a very exaggerated, crazy... Okay. Like, it feels like he moves through different dialects to try to do, like, for different comedy purposes, but it didn't read to me as a Kansai dialect.
Yeah. That's the one place where I feel like the translation... They brought in the fucking Dragon Quest people or something, because most of this translation is very straightforward. And then you get the Robin who they have talking in this like crazy Cockney accent, I guess. But it totally feels like something from one of the Dragon Quest localizations. And it's very funny to me.
Yeah, I mean, he's making like weird pop culture references and shit all the time. So it's definitely like one of those... Well, fuck. It's one of those, I imagine, if you're translating, you get handed this character, you're like, oh, shit.
Yeah.
It's like, what do I do with this guy? Oh, Jesus.
And then, of course, you have the Naze, Nani, Ploy sections, which is the wonderful world of ploys. And I love that opening. Naze, which basically just means like, what, why, ploy, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's so funny. And that is it's the bird, it's the Robin, and it is Alice together. And those are great. They have the little like sponsor cards at the end.
Yeah, like that's basically this game's version of, because there aren't bad endings in this game because there aren't any choices. Tsukihime and Fate Stay Night both have similar things that whenever you get a bad ending, there's a like comedy sequence that plays. For Fate Stay Night, that's where you get this like weird version of Fujimura Sensei and Ilya as student number one who give you advice on how to avoid death. And then in Tsukihime, I'm getting that it's Seal and Neko arc. But yes, I like that they have kept the tradition, and it's similar where it's like it's kind of drawn in a different art style, and it's weird and it's goofy and it's totally non-canonical, just out there crazy bullshit. But it's fucking hilarious.
Yep. And speaking of another big scene we should talk about, I realized we've talked around the edges of it. Aoko transporting herself 10 years into the future with the fifth magic. Jesus Christ, Sean. That's a pretty big mic drop of a sequence.
Yeah, I mean, what you were talking about earlier with, like, that by the end, Aoko and Alice have basically, like, left the rules of the Mages Association, which are inhuman in similar ways as to the situation that Sojiro has grown up in. Like, that's the moment where she does it, right? That she, for something that the Mages Association would 100% think is a completely trivial reason, she uses, true magic to fuck with time and I love that it's like how it describes it of like how impossible and insane it is. And she's having to like move time to like, oh, this moment has to now go to the end of all of existence, to the heat death of the universe. And I'm going to pull energy from this moment in time to make this happen. And it's because you can tell how much it's like, yes, she's using magic to do something that's impossible, but she's having to push against the boundaries of possibility the entire time, and how much like reality feels like it's shattering by her having to do this. And that if like one wrong step and it feels like all of existence will like snuff out, because it's like you are treading into some territory nobody's meant to fuck with, right? This is what it means to like reach the root and start fucking with that shit. Is like the whole world might just completely fall apart any second. But she's doing it to save Sojiro's life, right? Which is who's the person that she's meant to have been like killed fucking weeks ago. But now she like loves him, maybe not in a romantic way, that however you interpret that, but certainly loves him as a friend and as a companion. And is literally will move heaven and earth to bring him back and save his life. That's like the true climax of the game, right? Is finally she overcomes her fear of death and this like sort of red specter that appears whenever she starts to tread into the realm of using her real magic. And she overcomes all of that to save this boy. It's an incredible scene. It's so spectacular in terms of the presentation and the weird imagery of like galaxies and the universe and the root and all the shit they show you. It's fucking great.
It's that special Nasu touch of describing things that are beyond description. It like evokes for you just the bigness of creation, of the universe. It's mind-bending. The whole idea here that she borrows 10 years of her future, so she is now herself from 10 years of the future in this present moment. So she has those powers. She looks 10 years older. She's got the big long, her hair is much longer, representing her power as a mage. It's this bright, vivid red. She's got the cool costume. There's this big portrait they do of her that is one of the most badass, cool images in the game. It's something I would love to like almost have it on my wall or something. It's such a cool piece of art. And then she embraces the fifth magic, which I've heard of the third magic before, because that's what the Heaven's Feel is. I don't. We're actually recording this before we watch the Heaven's Feel movie, so I still don't know what the Heaven's Feel is, but I know it's the third magic. But this is the fifth, and that means that's bigger.
Yes. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's better or whatever. It's just the order, right? It's the order in which the like impossible has been achieved is the first, second, third, fourth, and so far the fifth magic is the arguably is the most recent and arguably the last magic. That like perhaps there is nothing else that is impossible that you can use magic to accomplish other than what the fifth magic does.
There's this little like almost poem about it where it says, at the beginning, the first changed all. Next, the second recognized many. In answer, the third showed the future. Tethered, the fourth concealed itself. And the final fifth had long since lost its significance. I love it. Cool. It's so good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I won't tell you what Heaven's Feel is, but I will say the second magic I know is Parallel Worlds. That's what Zelrech did. He will come up. Zelrech will come up. He's definitely like one of those proper nouns that pops up in a lot of crazy places. But Zelrech developed the second magic, which allows you to go to parallel universes. Which is I love it. Which allows you to do a different kind of form of time travel, because Toko actually references it. Where she's like, oh, that's what the fifth magic does? Well, the second magic can do that. And without Toko like really realizing, oh shit, oh no, you're like just really like you're not just like traveling through time, you're like manipulating time, you're like doing what you want with time. Oh fuck, okay, yeah, that is pretty cool. Like that is a pretty powerful magic.
Indeed. Any other specific scenes in the visual novel we haven't touched on you wanted to mention before we break?
I think we hit basically all the big stuff. Yeah. I mean, because it is that thing where it's like, when you break it down, it is very straightforward and it's like fairly low key of a story, which is one of the things that makes it work so well, right? It is not, there's not the Holy Grail war. It's not 1,000 roots of different stories and stuff. You can imagine a version of this game that is that. It's very easy to imagine a version of this game that has the Alice route and the Alco route and maybe a Toka route you unlock at the end or something. But there's something about the kind of the modesty of the story that really kind of makes it all work. Yeah.
And again, I can imagine a single movie version of this. I don't think that's crazy. There's been many books been many movies based on long books. I think this does have a clear first, second, third act structure. I would very much welcome a multi-movie adaptation because I think you could do that as well. But there's a solidity to the structure that I think is very accomplished and makes sense why they're doing this in movie format and not TV or something.
Yes.
One other thing to mention is there is an entire extra 5-hour scenario at the end called Anyone Can Sleep But Not Laugh. That is basically I called it it's kind of like Danganronpa in the Nasu-verse because it is a ridiculous murder mystery. It does have choices. It doesn't quite have branching paths. It kind of tallies up your choices at the end and sees if you won. But I had a lot of fun with it. It's goofy as shit.
Yeah, it basically feels like if people have played other Fate or typed in visual novels, it kind of feels like what something like Fate Holotraxia does, or I assume Kagetsu Toya, which is the Tsukihime fan disc sequel thing, does a similar thing where it's it's got some dramatic story elements in there. There's a kernel of a dramatic story in there, but it's also just an excuse to have all these crazy, goofy interactions between characters, as well as throwing in a random new character that you have no idea where the fuck she came from.
Yes.
That's so much Fate Holotraxia does that with 3 or 4 people are where the fuck who's this person? Where did this person come from? And then you're well, they're cool. I'll just roll with it. It's very funny to me that it just feels like they had I wonder if they had just some leftover ideas for a project that would have been bigger, and they're oh, let's just throw it in as this optional scenario here at the end and just put in the little extra characters and stuff like that.
You would think they added it for the 2022 version, and they didn't, because it does feel like an extra little sequel thing, but it was there in the original. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine it would be nearly as fun if you didn't have the voice acting, because the voice acting livens up the comedy so much.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of really funny stuff. The new character who is, I forget her full name because it's ridiculous, but her middle name is Riddle, which is why it's matches with the Hey Diddle Diddle stuff and all that with Alice, because she's an old friend of Alice's. There's this whole part where she makes her dad call in a helicopter from a local military base, and it crashes, and then she realizes she's going to have to work all these extra jobs for the rest of her life to pay off the military, and falls into a deep depression. Howling with laughter. It's very fun though. Do not miss that if you are going to play this. The game, it actually opens with a little message this is pretty long, so maybe take a break. And I think they're correct. If you finish Witch on the Holy Night, maybe go do something else and then come back to this scenario. That's what I did.
Yes.
But it's very fun, and it's essential to play because it's just a blast.
Yeah, it's amazing. And the character you're referring to, her full name is May Riddle Archalot.
That is a Gundam-worthy name.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh my god. Yeah. No, Mahoutsukai no Yoru. One of my favorite things we've talked about this season. One of my just favorite things. I fucking love it.
Yeah, it is it has brought visual novels back to life for me in this weird way. And I'm in the midst of the Tsukihime remake. I'm in its jaws right now.
Yeah.
But yes, it's Witch on the Holy Night, Mahoutsukai no Yoru. Just absolutely incredible visual novel. One of the all-time greats. And we're back, Jonathan. Oh,
that was
God.
a great conversation. I loved just spending those 100 minutes talking about Witch on the Holy Night with you just now, Sean.
Yes, just now, not what by the time this airs, it'll have been 6 months earlier or something.
Yeah, well, editing is magic. That's how this whole thing works. Yeah.
What is time, anyways?
What is time? It's been a hell of a time, though, Sean. This season on Japanimation Station, Ufotable Moonworks, we have talked about The Garden of Sinners, Fate Zero, Fate's Day Night Unlimited Blade Works, Fate's Day Night Heaven's Feel, today's menu for the Emiya Family, Witch on the Holy Night. Before we say farewell to the Ufotable Moonworks, do you want to just do a little bit of looking back? What should we do to like kind of wrap this season up, Sean?
I mean, for me, I have just loved doing this season because obviously this is something that I've been into the Kinoko Nasu world and Type Moon for quite a long time, and it's been incredibly fun to be able to share that. And then also it's like pushed me to dig deeper, which I've enjoyed, so it pushed me to play the Tsukihime remake. I'm replaying the game. I'm reading some of like the manga stuff. I've gotten like even deeper into this bullshit, which is fantastic because it is so good. And it has been incredibly rewarding to rewatch the kind of like the mainline stuff with that podcast vision, like really trying to break down, particularly at the Garden of Sinners and like doing like movie 5 Paradox Spiral for Garden of Sinners and stuff, being able to actually talk about Fate. It has been so much fun as a fan of this stuff to be able to go even deeper into that world.
And for me, having not had any exposure to any of it before, and I could not have told you what a Holy Grail War was before this started. I love it all. This has been a season where there's no weak link. There's no like, here was the lesser thing we watched. There's none of that. These are all like on a par for me. I think, I've been kind of debating in my head what is my quote-unquote favorite of the things we watched. And I think for me, and I'm curious to hear from you, Sean, I think it would be it is some kind of battle between Heaven's Feel and Kara no Kyokai, as the two that like feel the most sort of personal to me, like absolute favorite things. But again, they're all great. I think if I had to pick one specific thing we watched this season as like the shining idol on top of the mountain, it is probably Paradox Spiral, as just, that might be the single best production Ufotable has ever mounted. But Heaven's Feel is nipping pretty close at its heels, and those 2 TV shows are about as good as it gets. So it's a crazy set of content that we watched this year. Like it sets a high bar for future seasons of this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is it is a thing where I wouldn't really want to try to rank all of these, but I think you're right that the cleared like 2 peaks of the mountain or whatever are movie 5 Paradox Spiral for Garden of Sinners and the Heaven's Feel trilogy. I think those are the 2 best things here. I think those are for me, those are the 2 best things Ufotable has made, even if you throw in like Mugen Train, which would maybe be the 3rd head of the Hydra or some shit, if you wanted to put that in there as well. But it is just like Ufotable's whole work, like their line of work is so like unimpeachable. Like it's as good as any studio body of work as any studio has ever really produced. Maybe it's not as large as some of those other like bigger studios or studios with a longer history, but in terms of quality, like it's right there at the top. And it like, and I have like, in going through it like step by step, obviously there's some stuff that they had made pre-Kata no Kyokai, but in terms of when they really started to get big with Kata no Kyokai, following it from there all the way through to Heaven's Feel, us having already done some Kimetsu no Yaiba stuff in the past, it just like, you really like are faced with just how incredible and like consistently incredible their work is. And for me personally, like I think, we obviously didn't cover the game Fate's Day Night. That is to me, of all of these things, like Fate's Day Night as a visual novel is to me the thing I care about and is most personal to me. But in terms of the anime productions and the Ufotable adaptations, it is movie 5 and Heaven's Feel that I think are at the top.
Yeah, and, obviously I have not played as much of this outside stuff as you have, because you have quite a bit of a head start on me, like a decade. But I am looking forward to at some point playing through all of Fate's Day Night now that we're done with this project, playing through Tsukihime, which is the one Kinoko Nasu thing I have not like seen anything of yet. And I think that's also just something that has been fun this season. We talked about this a little bit last week, that like, I think all of these works are richer when you put them next to each other. I think that's how kind of the Kinoko Nasu-verse works. It's why we wanted to talk about Witch on the Holy Night today. I think having this podcast season where we really did, we went through chronologically with the Ufotable stuff. We also wound up playing this other visual novel on the side. It just kind of all came together to give us, I think, a richer appreciation than if we had just talked about any one of these things on their own.
Yeah, like if we had just done the Fate stuff, that would have been fun. but it would not have been nearly as rich, I think, as what we did do, which is start with Garden of Sinners, which is both the starting point for Ufotable and in some ways the starting point for Kinoko Nasu in terms of published work that, was like recognized. So yeah, like it definitely, I feel like it has been a good season for this podcast of like kind of, proving the concept of what this podcast is trying to do, which is to trace that kind of thing, that kind of timeline through history and see how all these different products and projects speak to each other and build on each other to as works of art towards something like Heaven's Feel,
Yeah, this is exactly, I think, what we wanted Japanimation Station to be. And so it's very fun to have done this season and now finished it, barring, our computers crashing in the final minutes of recording. Knock on wood there. But, wrapping it all up, it's so fun. I'm so glad we got to do this. And I'm so glad we got to watch all this stuff. Because truly, these are like all things that will be in like my personal canon going forward.
Yeah, and now I'm excited that people can start listening to them, because as of right now, of us recording this, the second episode just released for people, right, of
Yes.
the podcast? Yeah, so we are quite ahead of the game, but I'm excited. I've already seen nice comments and stuff. I'm excited for people to get to listen to all of the podcasts and to get these all out into the world, because we've been hard at work recording all these suckers.
We're going to be hard at work recording more. Do you want to tell the people, should we jump into, we're announcing 2 seasons, basically, a short season and a long season, one of which you planned, one of which I planned. Should we talk about them?
Yeah, so I'll let you, Jonathan. You can introduce your child of the two, the smaller season that you planned.
Yes. So the next season of Japanimation Station, these seasons will all be different lengths. I'm going to call it season 3 because then the numbering is easier for me on the production end. But the shorter season 3, which will air this summer, it'll air. We don't have the date quite yet, but we will probably have it around the time this episode is out in the world. So we will let you know. But airing this summer, we are doing a short season on Lupin the Third that I am calling The Classic Adventures of Arsène Lupin III. The goal being, we are looking at Lupin's adventures from his debut in anime in 1971 with Lupin III Part 1, on through some of the stuff from Part 2, the Red Jacket Adventures, Part 3, the Pink Jacket Adventures, some of his movies and TV specials, basically up until the turn of the century. So this is basically pre-2000s Lupin, ending with the 2002 special First Contact Episode 0, which is a fun kind of classic callback story where Lupin meets his crew. Lupin is something that I have loved kind of on the fringes. Obviously, Castle of Cagliostro, as a Miyazaki and Ghibli fan, is a favorite of mine, but I've seen more and more bits and pieces of it. I'm writing about the woman called Mine Fujiko in my dissertation, and a couple of other things, including the newer film, the CGI film Lupin III, the First. And so I've always wanted to do a deep dive into Lupin. There's a future season we might be doing that will also have some Lupin stuff in it. And so we thought, well, you know what? I've wanted to do this. You've never seen any Lupin stuff, right, Sean?
Yep. Yeah,
so
no,
you're completely new to it.
I'm obviously like familiar with it conceptually, and it's referenced so universally. It's like one of those. It's up there with like Doraemon and Crayon Shinchan as one of those like anime products and slash manga in Japan that is like universally beloved and is like on the list of, in terms of like popular lists for like everybody living in Japan, not just like nerds or whatever, is like one of everyone's favorite anime. So it's something I've always wanted to watch, but it is also a big, long series that has, a bunch of spinoffs and movies and, like this is part 1, here's part 2, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it's an intimidating series to get into. So I'm glad that you have some knowledge of it. So you have made a list of stuff that kind of narrows it down to something that will be approachable for the podcast. And that's good for me, because that means that I don't have to do any of that work for myself.
Yes. So think of this. This will kind of be like Lupin III 101, a nice introductory course into his adventures. I specifically left it off at 2002 in case we eventually want to do a follow-up season where we do the modern post-2000 stuff, which would also be fun. But this is going to be 6 episodes. We're going to have an episode on part 1, which is a short anime, so we're just going to do the whole thing. An episode on part 2, which is a very long anime. It's 150 episodes, so I have selected a number of episodes. We will give you the details details on which episodes and everything later on, but you will know what we're talking about. We're going to have an episode on Castle of Cagliostro itself and the other Lupin episodes Miyazaki directed in Part 2, because those have a life of their own and need to be talked about on their own terms. We'll do one on Part 3, the Pink Jacket Adventures, again doing select episodes, and then 2 episodes on some of the different specials and movies, including stuff like the Fuma Conspiracy, which is the one that has a completely different voice cast in Japanese. I'm excited to talk about The Legend of the Gold of Babylon, which is credited to Seijun Suzuki as the director, who is like a member of the Japanese New Wave. Yes.
Whoa, fucking yes. What?
Yes.
Like Tokyo Drifter, that...
Yes.
Okay, holy shit.
He also worked on Part 3, which was really inspired by his stuff. So he worked on Lupin for a little bit there. And again, going up to the year 2002. So we will give you all the details on that. There will be a little preview episode of what we will be covering in these 6 episodes. But I think it will be a ton of fun. And if you, like me or like Sean, has wanted to do a deep dive into Lupin, this will be a great place to start.
Yeah, I am extremely excited to get into that one. I've had the Part 1, the discotheque set for Part 1 forever.
Yes.
Because I bought it on the Blu-ray around the time I think actually they started releasing some of those sets. So I've been sitting on that one, knowing one day it would come in handy for this podcast. So that day has finally come.
So that'll be airing this summer. And while that's airing, we will be hard at work on Season 4 of Japanimation Station, which is going to be at least 3 times longer. Sean, what are we doing for Season 4 of Japanimation Station?
For Season 4, Jonathan, we are tackling our biggest task yet. We are going to be taking a look at the works of... if Ufotable is one of the best animation studios, well, there's another one that I would put right by their side in terms of quality and consistency of quality, and that would be Kyoto Animation, often called KyoAni. So we'll be doing an entire season on the works of KyoAni. I'm not going to go into what all of those episodes are going to be, because also there's a little bit more fluidity there, since it's a little bit further off in the future. But needless to say, we're not going to do literally every single thing that Kyoto Animation put out, because that would be like as long as fucking Weekly Suit Gundam. But we are going to hit the major stuff. You know, if you want to hear us talk about stuff like Clannad and the different animation adaptations of key visual novels, Suzumiya Haruhi, K-On!, Nichijou Hyoka, Hibike Euphonium, A Silent Voice in Violet Evergarden, those are our major targets. There might be some other stuff in there. There's enough KyoAni stuff that we could do a whole fucking season just with the shit we cut out on the current outline. But this is one I've wanted to do for a very long time. Kind of like right up there next to Type Moon for me, being able to talk about KyoAni in a totally different genre space, totally different style space than what we have typically covered. You know, a lot more stuff that will be a lot more like today's dinner menu at the Emiya house. But in a way that I'm really excited to get to that one.
I am too, because I've always wanted to do a deep dive on KyoAni, and I basically had, at a certain point, Sean, just started like siphoning them off, like, we're going to do a season, so I'm just not going to watch them yet. And now we get to do them all. That season is going to run at least like 20 episodes. It's going to be quite a bit longer than the Type Moon season. We will let you know the exact run of that when we are closer to it debuting. I would expect that in the sort of fall 2023 to debut. So these 2 seasons will take us through 2023. We will have other little things on and off, obviously. When this episode is airing, we should probably be decently through the next season of Gundam Witch from Mercury. So obviously when that season's finished, we'll have more on that. So there will be other things in Japanimation Station, but Season 3, we're meeting Lupin the Third. Season 4, we're going to Kyoto. It's going to be a great time, and I think 2023 is going to be a very fun year for this podcast.
Yes, it's been a hell of a start with Ufotable, and it's going to be a hell of a year. And boy, Jonathan, we got a lot of anime to watch.
Japanimation Station.